I think it has to be really close, I hear, which just drives me crazy, so we'll work with it. Welcome, everybody. Really glad we got to get to this point. This is a topic that, as Debbie mentioned at lunch, comes up often. So we'll spend about 3 hours, predators, prey, and landscape, and there are a lot of pieces to this one. So I'm looking forward to it very much. I think just for the official stuff, I'm Mary Wall, Chair of the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission. I'd like to call the December 11th, 2025 Fish and Wildlife Commission meeting to order. I'm going to do introductions. I'll ask the other commissioners to introduce themselves like we usually do first. And I'd like the two new commissioners, since this is their first meeting and our chance to welcome them, to take maybe a couple extra minutes to say a little bit about yourselves, if you will. So I will go first to Vice Chair Hatfield.
Good afternoon, Becky Hatfield Hyde, and just very happy to be here at this workshop, and just want everyone in the room to know that this is table number 1, and this is a competition, not like some sort of workshop. Sorry. Okay.
Want me to go ahead, Mary? So glad to be with you all this afternoon. My name is Hugh Morrison, just joining the commission. Really glad to be here with you all. Yeah, what can I say? Most of my career has been in fish and wildlife management in one way, shape, or form. Just retired from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about 8 months ago, something like that. But still very much invested in fish and wildlife management, particularly here in the state of Oregon, which is my home state. Glad to be a multi-generational Oregonian. So when the opportunity to join the commission, or at least put my name up in interest for joining the commission came up, I was ready to jump at the chance. Really have enjoyed working with ODF&W in the past, in my past career with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and had a chance to meet and work with some of the commissioners here in the past too. So glad to be part of this group, and maybe I'll leave it at that, Mary, unless you want me to build any more on that.
Thank you. Mark Labhart. I have the privilege of being on the commission. I live in Sisters, and welcome to our brand new commissioners. It's we're up to 7 now, which has been a while since we've had a full board or a full commission. So glad to have you here.
Bob Spellbrink, Commissioner, Celeste area, and over here too, bouncing around. Anyway, and to welcome the new commissioners. I'm glad to have a full commission finally.
Thanks, Bob. Dave Moldall, brand new commissioner. Absolutely thrilled to be here. I live with my family in Southwest Portland. I've got 2 young boys who I think would be fishing every day if I let them, but that's not allowed. I've spent the last 3 decades of my career in various conservation-focused energy, environmental planning, grassroots advocacy, and recently, and for the last decade plus, in the renewable energy business. So working in those capacities, been a lifelong hunter-fisher, lifer of big game hunting. This time of year, love to be out chasing upland game birds and thinking about steelhead fishing. So just absolutely thrilled to be here.
I think that leaves me. Am I right, Mary?
Yeah, we can hear you, Commissioner DeFries,
Okay.
if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Commissioner Hall DeFries. I'm here. Sorry to be the lone commissioner, not there in person. I look forward to meeting our 2 new commissioners when I get the chance in person, but really glad that you are here with us today. And now I am not the newest commissioner on the commission, so that's an exciting milestone for me as well. But I'm here in Baker County. I represent the Eastern region on the commission.
I just wanted to mention one other thing, and that is that we on this commission have spent a lot of time talking about landscape scale solutions, landscape scale work. And this seems like a chance to really think about a situation and a set of circumstances happening across the state in that broader context. So it seems like this is a chance to pull some pieces together and makes us look forward to this discussion. And I'm going to give it right back to you, Director, and to Brian to kick this off.
So we'll go through some quick introduction of the ODFW staff and guest speakers from Oregon State University that are with us today. I'm Brian Wolfer. I'm the Wildlife Division Deputy Administrator.
Good afternoon, Nicole Chernovsky. I am the Land Resources Program Manager at ODFW.
Tal Levy, I'm a professor of wildlife at Oregon State University. Afternoon, I'm Derek Broman. I'm the Game Program Manager for ODFW.
Hi, everyone. Sarah Reif, Habitat Division Administrator here at ODFW.
Hi, I'm Joel Ruprecht. I'm a research associate at Oregon State University.
Hey there. I'm Kiefer Titus. I am the West Region Wildlife Research Supervisor with ODFW.
Good afternoon. I'm Bernadette Graham Hudson. I'm the Wildlife Division Administrator here at ODFW. Hello, my name is Michelle Dennehy. I'm Acting Information and Education Administrator for ODFW.
Good afternoon, Darren Clark. I oversee our East Region Wildlife Research Program.
Sam Fino, Carnivore and Fur Bear Coordinator with ODFW.
All right, and I'm Debbie Colbert. I'm the Director of Fish and Wildlife. And just a few quick words before we get started. This is, and thank you so much, Commissioner DeFries, for joining us online. We really appreciate you being willing to kind of join us virtually. It is a workshop, so we will be using the microphone when we have presentations. But just recognize that there's going to be quite a bit of breakout, which we're not going to mic because, you know, just by the nature of the workshop, but we will be streaming the entire thing and it is recorded, just so folks know. I just wanted to kick off just how excited we are to do this workshop, how much I appreciate all of the staff, Brian, Sean, Derek, Darren, Joe, Sam. Who am I forgetting? I feel like I'm forgetting somebody. Paul, yeah, all of you and our awesome guest for pulling together such an outstanding conversation today. And it is intended to be a conversation, very thoughtful about making sure that there are opportunities for you all to engage in conversation and be processing real time some of what you're hearing and some of the questions that you have. It's also something that's really important to us, this topic of kind of predator-prey dynamics and something as an agency that we're really leaning into. We, just like our commissioners, we hear about this all the time from many different perspectives, whether it's from ag producers, from a damage perspective, or it's from hunters that are concerned about kind of some of our populations and where they are and the impacts of predation. So this is a conversation that we're leaning into as an agency. We hope that today sets a really good foundation for all of you on this topic. And I think it's going to be one that we continue to use as a touch point. I anticipate at least a few times in the coming year, one of you as commissioners is going to go, it's kind of like when we talked about X at the workshop. So this is really about planting some seeds and setting a foundation. We're not going to leave today with answers. This is not going to be where we kind of come up with a to-do list. This is really about us deep diving and just increasing our understanding, having a common vocabulary, a common understanding of some of the challenges. And really, we're also very excited that we can offer it because the commissioners have been asking for this. Every year we do a survey of our commissioners and they tell us, like, what do you want to learn more about? What do you want to talk about? And this repeatedly is a topic of interest for our commissioners. So we're really excited to be able to be responsive to that need. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to our moderator for the day.
Thank you, Director. So I'm going to give a real quick overview of what today's going to look like and a quick introduction here. So to begin with, a lot has changed in Oregon over the last 40 to 50 years at that landscape scale. And some of these changes have been pretty gradual. Others have been not so gradual. But these changes have affected a lot of our wildlife populations and in different ways. That includes ungulates and predators. And so we've talked over the last couple of years with the commission about the status of our ungulate populations, both with our big game reg setting process for setting regulations, as well as the mule deer plan revision and those topics. And so we're not going to spend a lot of time today looking at graphs of ungulate populations. And so as a quick reminder, we've seen some real declines in some of those ungulates. So mule deer, we've got people in Oregon that in their lifetime have witnessed a 50% decline or more in our mule deer population. We've seen some declines in our black-tailed deer populations. Elk are a different story. Elk populations really have peaked in the late 90s in Oregon. And now, while we have some places where we don't have as many elk as we'd like, we're really dealing with an issue of elk distribution challenges. And so many of our units, most of our units in the state are at or above management objective, but we're seeing elk shift from private land or from public land to private land, and that comes with challenges. And so as we start to talk about that, we thought this would be a great topic for the workshop. And we want to set the stage for today by first going over some of the landscape scale changes that we've seen over the last 40 to 50 years. You'll see those topics on the easels in the corners here. And we're going to do what I'm going to call a lightning round talk. Just real briefly, what are some of the changes that we've seen there? We'll then have a little breakout and we'll get to discuss amongst our tables what those drivers are and our own experiences with them. Then we're going to transition into research and what research has told us about those changes and help us understand that a little bit better. We're going to have 2 breakout sessions through those research talks. And then we'll wrap up the day with a little bit of a summary and a chance for some reflection from the commissioners if you'd like to take that. And so first, really going to start off, we'll start off with Derek Broman for our, what I'm going to call like a little lightning quick talk on some of our 4 big landscape scale drivers.
Okay, so let's see if that works. Great. So again, I'm Derek Broman. I'm the Game Program Manager, and I'm going to be talking about some changes over time regarding predator populations, policy, and what our current status is. So Oregon is a fantastic state with very high species richness. And even on the carnivore front, we've got about 20 terrestrial carnivore species in the state of Oregon. And that ranges from a 300-pound black bear to a 3-ounce short-tailed weasel. But for the sake of today's conversation, I'm going to limit it to those species that are known to prey on our native ungulates, primarily deer and elk. And so that really limits that list down to bears, cougars, wolves, bobcats, and coyotes. But even across those 5 species, when we talk about carnivore conservation and management, we actually have a number of different classifications that apply to those species. Bears, cougars, and wolves are big game, so similar to like deer and elk. Bobcats are classified as a fur bearer, the group of animals that were historically harvested for fur. And when it comes to coyotes, they are an unprotected mammal in ODFW's eyes, which means that there is no closed season for that species. However, there is also dual designation where they are a predatory animal and under the jurisdiction of Department of Agriculture on for private landowners and their agents. So I'm not going to have an exam of making you memorize all of that, but ultimately just the take home being that just to even talk about this guild of species, we're talking about various categories of policy and even jurisdiction. Now, looking at these species and looking about the history of these animals in the state of Oregon, you start to see these kind of three major phases of carnivore conservation and management. And so this first phase was prior to the 1970s, where it was a period that was unregulated. We had no regulations, there was limited data collection. We actually oftentimes had bounty programs that were state sanctioned. The use of all tools, including poison, were used to try and eradicate these species. And we saw species decline really across the board, and that was the case for those species as well as many other wildlife species in the state. Then we saw about in the 1970s this environmental conservation movement where at the federal scale we saw the creation of the Endangered Species Act, the EPA, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. But here in Oregon, we also saw some changes that occurred from where we now had state authority given to the ODFW, or at that time, the State Game Commission, to regulate and have management authority over those species. And so this resulted in a shift from predator bounties and indiscriminate killing to regulated harvest and take. And so we saw increased data collection, management plans, management strategies and objectives. What was really great is we saw a lot of research kick off during that time period to help generate data and assist in using science for decision making. And then the third phase, which I consider we're still in right now, about in the 90s and the early thousands, we started to see really the fruits of that good wildlife management that took place once authority was given over to the State Wildlife Agency, where we now had data and research rapidly advancing to help in decision making. We now saw more robust management plans, a heavy use on science, incorporation of Oregon research and data, and additional harvest regulations and monitoring. And at times, we were seeing very prescriptive and purposeful management actions. But we also saw more policy changes and interest in carnivore management through petitions and ballot initiatives. So speaking generally, we've seen all of these populations increase over the last 50 years since the jurisdiction was given to the state of Oregon, or to the ODFW. And some real world examples of what this looks like. One example is looking at cougar populations or cougar estimates over time. During that period of unregulation, we saw populations to decrease pretty substantially. And then once the authority was given to ODFW, we saw that population increase. And then in 1994, through the ballot initiative Measure 18, which prohibited the use of hounds for the take of cougars, you saw, which was a cougar population that was already increasing pretty fast, an even higher rate of increase. And here in about the last decade, we've really seen a plateau in that population statewide. And then just another real world example looking at gray wolves. We didn't have historical estimates of wolves, but through those very well orchestrated bounty programs, wolves were eradicated in the state of Oregon. The last wolf was observed in 1947. But you can see in this more recent phase, a lot of major policy actions that took place even before wolves had returned to Oregon with the adoption of the first wolf plan in 2005. And all of this is occurring while we've been seeing our wolf count increase greatly in recent years. So with all of these species, you can identify their management in the framework that really at the core of it is to ensure that we're not going to see these populations return to those very, very low numbers where we're now flirting with, extirpation or needing to consider listing on the state or federal Endangered Species Act. All the while, we're very conscious of these other arms of this management framework, considering things like safety, damage, harvest, but also co-management with other prey, with other wildlife species, in this case, the prey of these species like deer and elk. And so this is a framework that is applied to most of those carnivore species that we're discussing. And so to wrap up, our current status is that we have resilient carnivore populations here in Oregon, which is greatly due to those changes enacted over 50 years ago. So I'll hand things off to Sarah to talk about Forest management changes.
So I'm going to help fill in another piece of this complex story. I'm going to focus in on prey, specifically ungulates, deer and elk, and paint the picture a little bit more for you in terms of what some of those landscape scale factors are that are driving ungulate populations and their distributions here in Oregon. The piece I'm going to focus on is federal forest management. Why focus on federal forest management in this discussion? Well, it's because it plays an outsized role in the story. As many of you well know, nearly half of Oregon is forested. And much of the summer range and transitional range for deer and elk in Oregon is in this forest land. And roughly 60% of this forest land is federally owned and managed. So how it is managed has direct impacts on ungulate habitat quality, which in turn affects ungulate distribution and health, and potentially affects ungulate demographics and trend. I'm actually going to jump ahead. I'll come back, I promise, and then I'll backtrack. But I wanted to take you to this slide just briefly to talk about the historic range of variability of Oregon's forests. Prior to European settlement, the forests were maintained by fire and other natural disturbance events in a manner that created a patch mosaic of forest stand age, or cirral stages, as they're referred to here. Openings and wet meadows were maintained by abiotic site conditions or engineers like the beaver. Early cirral forests, as you can see on the left, were maintained by disturbance events like fire, landslides, weather events. And over time, early cirral forests would transition to mid-cirral, so the canopy starts to close in, and eventually to late cirral or old growth conditions that would persist until the next significant disturbance event reset the system or reset the clock back to early cirral. So with that dynamic, ever-shifting patch mosaic of a forest, it species that align with those different cirral stages of the forest. And I'll note where ungulates are on this spectrum. They really like that early cirral condition, particularly when it has an understory shrub and herbaceous component. I'm going to go back. After European settlement and the establishment of the federal forest system, early management objectives were focused primarily on large-scale, high-volume timber harvest to support America's timber economy and growth in the nation. The landscape shifted dramatically away from those late cirral stages, and the amount of early cirral forest conditions were much more common. And remember, who loves those early cirral conditions? The deer and the elk. With time, management objectives shifted more towards sustainable yield and greater control of and limitation of timber harvest volumes on federal forests. So around that same era that Derek was talking about in the 70s, Congress passed the National Forest Management Act in 1976, and every national forest was required to develop and adopt a forest management plan with input from the public that allowed for maximum sustained yield while conserving other resource values like fish and wildlife habitat. In NIFMA, forest plans were directed to be updated on each forest every 15 years. However, in practice, it can be really challenging for national forests to have the capacity and to have the public support to revise their forest plans. For example, the Blue Mountain Forest Plan, which is the Malheur, the Umatilla, and the Wallowa-Whitman National Forests, they adopted their plan in 1990. They are still operating under their 1990 plan. It is tough to get those things revised and passed. There's a lot of conflicting social interests at play there. And then if you fast forward to 1994, there was adoption of the Northwest Forest Plan, which was born out of scientific evidence and further shifting social values, directing national forests in the Pac Northwest to focus on protection of late successional habitats. This was to support habitat for species that require late cirral conditions like the spotted owl, the marbled murrelet, and many native salmon and trout in the waterways. This shift in federal forest management over the last 40 years has measurably changed the structure of our federal forests in Oregon. In this slide, you're looking at a landscape on the Willamette National Forest. In the upper image from 1984, you can see all these little dots. Even I hope you can, at least even at a distance. I need to put my glasses on, but hopefully you all can see that. Those were harvested stands. Okay, and then if you look at 2022, you can see where all those dots have filled in with green. That is, an infilling forest and a closing canopy. You can even see the boundary of the forest here on the upper part of this lower image from 2022. And that is the private timberland, federal forest land boundary. So what we've seen is a dropout of the early cereal stages as fires have been suppressed and as timber harvest has significantly reduced. And what we have is an overabundance of that mid-cereal forest condition that limits biodiversity and limits habitat for deer and elk, which precludes the understory that they need for forage and nutrition. So what does that look like on the, this is also the case on the east side too. It's not just a west side phenomenon. This picture is from the Fremont National Forest, Bald Mountain. It's so you can see in this slide, it's a little bit harder to tell, but more open canopy conditions here at the top of Bald Mountain, really open down here in the foothills with a network of roads that were likely used for harvest. And then down here so this is from 1984 on the upper picture, and then this is 2024 on the lower picture, and you can see how the canopy has really filled in. So same trend, east and west side. Here's this slide again. As I said, we've really kind of landed in this mid-cereal stage as being the most common condition across the national forests in Oregon, precluding habitat for a lot of species in both the early and late cereal stages. And what does that look like on the ground? This is an example of a forest that was in the Klamath Mountains that was harvested. This is sort of right after harvest. That would be early cereal condition. It starts to fill in, and within 20 years, you start to have a closed canopy and a reduction of understory. So it happens pretty quickly, certainly faster on the west side, but the same sort of trend without that continued disturbance, that reoccurring fire or some sort of level of harvest, you do start to get that canopy closure. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. There's some positivity out there. There's positive steps that are being taken to restore Oregon's forests. There are a lot of local forest collaboratives that are doing great work on federal lands with local stakeholders and partners. Sometimes it's very wildlife inclusive in terms of the design of those projects, but I think folks are finding it hard to meet the scale needed to meet the landscape scale change that we've experienced. We don't really have enough resources, capacity, and markets for that small diameter wood that we would need to do the restoration at the scale that we need to be doing. I'll just say, I think you can start to see why ungulates are headed back to private versus public lands as we're starting to see harvest and early cereal stages occurring mostly on the private lands. And then drought conditions exacerbate this issue, which Darren Clark will talk about in a little bit. The department is deeply involved in statewide and local collaborative efforts to restore diversity on Oregon's forests. We see fire risk reduction and restoration of habitat diversity as mutually complementary goals, and we are really leaning in where we can to support those efforts in forest collaboratives around the state and at the statewide level. Last slide with just some key takeaways for us here. Hopefully the picture I'm painting here is of basically a 40-year experiment. It hasn't been that long since we've had this federal forest managed change. But in that time, we've effectively shrunk that early cereal habitat. We are seeing closure of the mid-cereal canopy and ongoing fire suppression affecting that habitat quality for deer and elk. And when you couple this with increased recreational pressure that Brian will talk about in a little bit on the federal public lands, you have landscape scale cumulative impacts that are most certainly driving ungulate distribution toward private lands and very likely affecting population trends and demographics, which Darren will get into during his presentation as well. With that, I'm going to pass it to Darren.
I'm going to go ahead and stand up so I don't feel like I'm sitting in the middle of a circle, people staring at the back of my head. So climate change is happening throughout the world. And this isn't really an emerging challenge, but it is a dynamic challenge that we are facing with climate change ongoing and the effects to be seen moving forward. The biggest things we see coming out of climate change are related to changes in our weather patterns as a result of a changing climate, where we're seeing rising air temperatures and changing precipitation patterns. So we see increased drought frequency in summer, and we also see reduced snowpack in winter, which is ultimately going to influence some of the habitat and quality of the habitat available to our wildlife species. The other aspect of climate change that we see is these more extreme weather events. So the figure there represents the 2022 heat dome that most folks probably remember. That was a really stressful period on wildlife and their habitat. Trees were dying because of this heat dome, and wildlife populations were also very stressed from this event. And ultimately, these changes we're seeing in climate do have impacts on ungulate habitat. And the reason we're seeing this is through changes in the vegetation. Deer and elk are herbivores and must eat plants. And one of the bigger changes we are seeing with climate change is a change in plant phenology. And phenology is just the timing of when plants green up, they flower, and then turn brown or senesce for the year. And why this is so important is green forage is way better for deer and elk. There's higher protein content, higher energy, and that's how they're going to build their fat reserves to make it through winter. But through our plot data out of the Blue Mountains, Northeast Oregon, we've seen we lost about 2 to 3 weeks of the growing season, where plants are now in that brown state for about 2 to 3 weeks longer. And this is really important from the standpoint deer and elk try to put on body fat to make it through winter, but the females are also have high energetic demands during the summer with raising their calves and having the energetic demands of lactation placed on them. So this reduced forage quality and ultimately quantity on the landscape is going to influence habitat conditions for our deer and elk populations. The other aspect we see with increased drought frequency, the landscape is drier, plants are in that brown condition, they're more prone to fire. We also have drought and higher heat, which is also causing increased fire frequency. So if we look at the last, since the 1990s in Oregon, we are seeing this uptick in the amount of acres burned throughout the state. And fire in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. The landscapes are, many of the plant species are evolved or even dependent on fire to persist. But what we've got to see lower intensity, smaller fires that created this mosaic of habitat conditions where we have early sterile conditions, remnant stands of old growth in those mid-sterile stages mixed across in this patchy network created by fire. What we're seeing now in increasing frequently are these really large, high intensity or severe fires that are completely removing all vegetation from these areas. And just clearly looking at that picture, there's not much there for a deer and elk to eat. And there on the right, I want to correct that. So there's still value in this within the future. It's not going to be decades before deer and elk will ever use this again, but in the short term, that is a really diminished habitat for deer and elk. The other issue we see with fire, and this is particularly in our sagebrush systems, where we do have invasive annual grasses coming in, is when fires go through these landscapes now, non-native annuals tend to dry out even earlier than native vegetation, which helps spread wildfire. It does result in these really high intensity burns in these areas. That removes the shrub component and basically converts these areas into this sea of non-native annual grasses. That is a really hard state to move back out of. And these non-native annual grasses are not great for deer and elk. So when we're talking about non-native annual grasses, we're talking about things like cheatgrass, medusa head, and vintnata. All of those species have really low value to deer and elk. Of those three, cheatgrass is really the only one that deer and elk will actually eat, and they will only eat it really about this time of year when cheatgrass is actually starting to green up. So they can get a little benefit out of it, but the rest of the year it is a negative for them. It competes with native forage that they do rely on, and then it's strictly just unpalatable to them in other weights of the year. So climate change ultimately is leading some changes in plant communities, our disturbance regimes, and how that's modifying habitat across the landscape. And this does have implications for our native deer and elk species. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Brian to talk about recreation impacts.
Thank you, Darren. So the fourth landscape scale driver that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about is changing recreation patterns and give you a sense of what some of the changes in disturbance from visitors on our public lands means in terms of a scale. So Oregon's population has doubled in the last 50 years. As you can see, it's a pretty steady increase. We're not seeing much change in that trajectory. And no surprise to any of us, our populations are really based in certain areas. That's, the Willamette Valley, Bend, et cetera. And so we can tend to, we will see those drastic changes in habitat that come from an open field turning into a parking lot or, a department store or a subdivision going in. And we may not notice some of the other changes happening when it comes to disturbance. And so with this increased Oregonians in the state, we also have Oregonians that are here. And one of the big things I love about Oregon is our outdoors, and so does everybody else. And so we have a lot of outdoor recreation. And this is something that we want to see. We want Oregonians connected to the outdoors. We want them to value the outdoors. But it does come as a challenge and a disturbance to our ungulate populations. On the far right, you'll see one of those recreation activities that we, as a department, have some control over, and that's hunting. And so this study represented here was from 2017, looking at activity days spent afield. And hunting had about 11 million activity days afield. And you can get a sense for the huge volume of days spent afield for a number of other activities. From 10 million days of backpacking, not your day trip at a local trail, but this is like backcountry backpacking, gathering forest products, 17 million days. We love people to go out and watch birds, and we encourage bird watching. That's 41 million days in 2017 of people out in our wild places, interacting with wildlife, and one of the challenges. I will point out that off-road vehicle driving there on the far left, 19.4 million days in the field with motorcycles, ATVs, side-by-sides, et cetera. And some of those are, to me, were very surprising numbers to look at how much time people are spending afield. And then when you look, kind of zero in on one of our forests, so the Willamette National Forest, which is just east of us here, it includes the Middle Fork Willamette drainage, the McKenzie, the Santiam. This is one of 11 national forests in Oregon, and it is our largest forest. It also had a lot of timber harvest back in the days of heavier timber harvest, and a lot of road construction in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And where that leaves the Willamette National Forest now is 6,550 miles of U.S. Forest Service maintained roads. It's a big number. What does that mean? If we were to stretch out the roads on the Willamette National Forest and lay them out from where we're at here in Salem, that would reach all the way to New York City and back again with a few hundred miles to spare. Admittedly, about 1,000 miles of those roads are not drivable at this point. And so if you laid them out, you'd be able to drive to New York City. And on your way back, you'd run out of drivable road around Boise, somewhere around Boise, and you'd have to walk decommissioned roads for the last little bit. But it's an astounding number. On top of that, we see a lot of trails. We see a lot of increase in ATV trails and off-road trails, but also hiking trails. I saw a figure that our national forests in Oregon have 11,000 miles of hiking trails on them that are maintained by the forest. So a large volume of opportunity for people to get out and be in our wild places. So we tend to think, okay, but we still have our wilderness, right? We have these places where wildlife is going to avoid people. They're going to get out into the wilderness. And those are those sanctuary places, but we're even seeing impacts there. And as an example, we have our Central Cascades Wilderness Permit System. And this permit system went into place because of the amount of visitor use in those wildernesses. Forest Service determined that it was impacting their ability to meet those wilderness characteristics that they're required to meet in federal law. And so the Three Sisters Wilderness alone, over a 5-year time period, jumped from about 47,000 visitors in a year to 132,000, just an incredible increase in the number of people. Again, it's great. We want to see people outdoors, but then we have to manage the impacts. And the Forest Service's response to that was implementing a permit system where Wildernesses in the Central Cascades have limited permits for overnight stays in certain parts of the year. Some trails have limited daytime use, but that still displaces people because we all want to get outdoors. And so if you can't get into that place that had become too crowded, you get displaced into the next place, the neighboring place. And so the take home message here is that we have these year-round human activities on our public lands. They do have some impacts. You're going to hear about that in some of our research talks, and so I'm leaving that for later. And when you hear those discussions about how elk and deer react to roads and vehicles and other disturbance, hopefully you have a sense of how much of that is occurring in our landscape. Next, we're gonna, so that concludes my the lightning round presentations here. And I think before we head to our breakouts, stay in place for our breakouts, one thing that maybe I failed to talk about in my introduction is that as we look at these landscape level changes, these are a snapshot of a couple of them. We've got a number of other changes that have happened. We've had disease, new and emerging diseases impact our ungulates in the last 50 years. I talked about human disturbance and recreation, but we've got development and roads, changing land use. We've got a lot of other factors in addition to these four. And I don't want you to walk away from this lightning round talk thinking that these things are all bad. Like some of these changes are good changes and necessary changes, but they create some challenges. And some of what was good for deer, say in forest management, was really bad for other species. And so as forest management changed, well, now when we manage ungulates, that affects how we manage those ungulates and what their performance is. And so for the next part of our afternoon, we're going to take 20 minutes for a little breakout discussion at your tables. We tried to have a mix of speakers, expertise at the tables with each of the commissioners. And we've got a little series of questions. You've got them there on your table for discussion. We're going to spend about 15 minutes talking about a couple of starter questions. One is, was there anything surprising in the information that was shared in this first round? What have been your personal experiences of these changes? What other landscape scale changes have you observed across Oregon? And what are the primary impacts that you anticipate to ungulates from these landscape scale changes? And we're going to spend about 15 minutes talking about that at our tables. Hopefully it's not too loud and we can accomplish that. And then we will spend just 5 minutes with somebody from each group giving a couple, one or two main takeaway points from your discussion. Commissioner DeFries, I'm sorry, but we didn't have a way to have a virtual option for you. And so if you can bear with us and put some thought into these topics, that'd be great. And then we'll be back after this. We'll jump into some research topics and research presentation.
its success. Someone brought up just spatially, to think about this spatially, as you get less and less appropriate habitat, you have prey that are just forced into smaller areas and prey and predator interacting in those smaller areas. So they're simply more vulnerable. One positive, because it is all kind of depressing, one positive out of all this is we can better quantify and understand the impacts because of all the new tools that we have. We talked about the time-lapse photos, just showing sort of how much things have changed and the need for a mosaic of forest age classes.
I volunteered to represent the group. We had great conversation here. Right out of the gate, we all agreed that we were surprised at the magnitude of change in the cougar population. So that was really eye-opening, the graph that you shared, Derek. And also just noting, when you look at the recreation, sort of the proportionate representation of the different types of recreation, the way in which hunter days was a fairly small proportion relative to some of the other forms of recreation like hiking and bird watching, et cetera. And yet that is, the majority of funding for the ODFW. So just noting that we've talked about that a lot in this group, but personal experience, lots of good conversation there, really kind of reflecting on the fires of 2020 and the heat dome of 2022 and the way that played out. But we also talked about sort of growing up or, watching Oregon during the Northwest Forest Plan era and the sort of shifting attitude toward don't touch the forest and the impact that that has had, and that perhaps the pendulum swung too far in valid response to what was overharvest in a lot of places, but as often happens, the pendulum can sometimes swing too far the other direction, and how you get beyond that, how sometimes it takes a catastrophic fire event to bring the sides together again. We're seeing a lot of that. That's usually what is the catalyst for forest collaboratives. So, and then we didn't quite get to impacts, but in terms of what other landscape changes are really important to this conversation, we just talked about the cumulative effect of development and land use, and then also the lack of affordable housing in our cities and towns and the way that leads to what Commissioner Hatfield-Hyde referred to as desperation sprawl. So on your public lands, when you see sort of those tent cities or trailer cities and the impact that that is having on the public land landscape is pretty significant.
Okay, so we'll do our table, and then Commissioner Halder-Freeze, we'll see if you have some thoughts also when we're done with this segment.
Thank you, Brian. Our conversation is one of those where we just got started and we could go for a long time. Just three things that I would mention. One is that somebody at this table really crystallized that there's a lot of desire for thinning and people want to do it, but there is pushback, all kinds of pushback, different reasons. It's just like everything else we do. There's so many nuances and complexities. Another one was that I thought was really interesting was the pressure is intense to build new trails, new recreational facilities. ATV, this was, I think, especially true in Central Oregon, but I think everybody has seen this. ATVs everywhere. It occurs as you hear these, we're the problem. Again, it's usually us that we're the problem. Hopefully the collaboratives and other forms of solution seeking could come out of that, because if we're the problem, maybe we could do something about it, but clearly we are. There are a lot of these activities. And the third one I thought was really interesting in terms of touching on a potential solution, the quality of early cereal habitat on private lands tends to be pretty low in a lot of cases, in part because of the high use of herbicides. And maybe that's an opportunity for our staff at these tables and other people to, if we have any money to put into this, we put some in the Forest Service, we put some in the private lands. Maybe that's a place where we could put some money to not have the spraying that stops the deer and elk from being able to use it. So probably did a disservice to the way people presented it, but
Thank you. Commissioner Hall DeFreeze?
Sure. I don't know if I have much to add beyond what was said, but I would echo, Sarah, some of the graphs that were shown, I think were really impressive to look at, interesting to look at. The user days was really fascinating to me. But I think the thing that I think about as we went through all these topics is how there's a certain feedback loop between all of them. Forest management begets fire, more severe, larger forest fires because of fire suppression. That impacts how recreationists are using these forests, congregating them into smaller areas because they don't want to go to burned areas. And so it all kind of just feeds into one another. And I think that that's a really interesting dynamic that I run into a lot in this type of work, or in my work, is how all of those different landscape scale topics actually all interact with one another and kind of can compound the issue even further. So yeah, really enjoyed listening to all of that.
Thank you. Very good points there. So next, we're going to jump into a little bit of research around habitat and disturbance, and we're going to hear from Dr. Darren Clark. I've got to figure out how to get the presentation up here real quick. And following this presentation, we will have a second short breakout discussion.
All right, I'm going to spend some time going over our habitat and human disturbance subjects here. So really just want to start out with kind of what a definition of habitat is. This comes from a publication from the Wildlife Society. And habitat's the resources and conditions present in an area to produce occupancy, which may include survival and reproduction by a given organism. Boiling that out a little bit more, it's basically the conditions, so environmental conditions, available plants, forage, all the conditions that go into this that allow species to actually use that area. And then different species have different limits on what they can use, and the habitat that's available limits distributions and whether the species is present or not. We think specifically about ungulate habitat. Some of the key things we need to think about are the food, minerals, and water, how they get those. Things like thermal cover, so shade in the summer, and then during the winter, being able to get under a tree to prevent radiation loss to the atmosphere and stay warmer. Things like security from disturbance, security from predators. We have specific aspects of summer range and winter range that differ. And then there's also the importance of the migration routes that connect summer range and winter range together. From an ungulate standpoint, they are an herbivore. And so one of the things we think about is the nutritional carrying capacity. And this just boils down to the resources are limited. There's only so many vitamins and minerals out there, forage biomass. The quality varies, so the amount of digestible energy or protein that's in the plants. And ultimately, these resources limit the population and ultimately determine how many animals can be on the landscape. And when we think about nutritional carrying capacity, this is dynamic. It varies temporally and spatially. So the figure there on the right kind of showing what we were talking about earlier with early seral stands. But this is in relation to forage biomass for deer. So those earlier seral conditions create increased forage biomass. As you get to those mid-seral stages, it declines. And then when the forest canopy starts to open up again at old growth forests, you get more vegetation growing that deer and elk can eat. And biomass starts to go up a bit, but does not provide the peaks you see out of those early seral stages. But we know that over time, weather and climate patterns are changing. And so that may raise or lower the peaks and valleys on this curve. During drought conditions, this is going to drop. During wetter conditions, it would increase. We can think about like forest management here. Wildfire is also a key feature that resets successional stages for forested sands. Again, getting into invasive species when we have non-native annual grasses invading, reducing available forage for deer and elk. That changes the nutritional carrying capacity. Then we also have to think about competition. When one animal eats something, it's no longer there for another. And so deer compete with each other. They compete with elk. They compete with domestic livestock for the same resources. And then other small mammals and things that also eat plants. And so all of this does result in this dynamic nutritional landscape. And why are we so concerned about this? Well, habitat is ultimately the foundation for wildlife population. If you don't have habitat, that species is not going to be present. And so for ungulates, a key thing related to habitat is nutritional resources, which nutritional resources are important because it influences the fat reserves or the nutritional condition of females. And fat reserves are really critical because they determine demographic rates of ungulate populations. When we're talking about demographic rates, we're talking about pregnancy, birth dates, growth rates of fawns, survival rates of fawns, and survival of does themselves. So as you see reduced fat reserves in females, you'll see declining pregnancy rates, later birth dates, lower calf and fawn survival. And ultimately, if resources are bad enough, the does or cows themselves are going to die as well. Another important aspect of this is security. So animals need to feel secure. And so when they're not feeling secure, that will alter their habitat use. It may push them into areas of less quality, and they're not able to use the high quality portion of the landscape because they don't feel secure there. And two of the big factors that influence security are predators and humans, and ultimately we are predators of deer and elk as well. And so our movements and presence on the landscape influence how deer and elk feel secure on the landscape, which does change their behavior and alter their habitat use. But the other key aspect to think about with predators and humans is we actually directly remove animals from the populations as well. So we do have influence, and predators have influence on survival rates and ultimately population size of our deer and elk populations. So I want to move next to talking about security, and the main focus here is going to be about human disturbance and how human presence on the landscape influences ungulates. So the main ways that us being on the landscape and our recreational activities or whatever we're doing out there, one of the things that can happen is physiological responses in deer and elk. They can have increased stress levels, and just as all of us are as well, as when we're stressed, we're not as healthy as we normally are. I'm not going to focus much more on that. That's a specialty research topic I don't have really much to do with. But I'm going to focus more on the behavioral responses. But things I won't really focus on much further is increased vigilance. So as humans are out there, deer and elk watch us while we're out there. They spend less time feeding. And if you're not eating, you're not gaining calories and putting on fat reserves. But the bigger things I'm going to focus on here are changes in movement and changes in habitat use as a result of human disturbance on the landscape. So one of the great things about Oregon is we have the Starkey Experimental Forest and Range. Just transitioning there. And so the Starkey Experimental Forest and Range is a 40 square mile area with the ungulate-proof fence around it. So we can conduct experiments and look at how deer and elk respond to different things, whether it's habitat treatments or in this case, outdoor recreation. So for this experiment, we looked at the effect of ATVs, mountain bike riders, hikers, and horseback riders on elk behavioral response. And when we're talking about behavioral response, we're looking at flight distances, how far they move away, how quickly they return back to their normal behavior, and how they change their habitat use patterns. I'm not going to get into a ton of the details of what that looks like. Elk did not like any of these recreational disturbances. They respond, they move away, they change how they use the landscape to each of these activities. But far and away, motorized vehicles, ATV use had by far the greatest effect. And that tails off from there. So the noise associated with ATVs, the speed at which they move is one of the big drivers of what elk respond to. Mountain bikes sort of similar. They move through the landscape pretty quick. Deer and elk aren't used to seeing things coming through that fast, and so they will respond to that. Hikers, they just see us as predators, so they don't really like us walking through and seeing us that much either. And we think that on the horse side, that's kind of low because it's another big herbivore moving through and maybe not quite associated with humans, but it does, elk do still respond to that. One of the other big effects we see is hunting. So again, this is work out of the Starkey Experimental Forest. And so the top, these are effectively heat maps. So the warmer colors represent where animals were at. The cooler colors represent where they spend less time. So we're looking at the elk archery hunt and elk rifle hunts that were occurring. So the top panes there show the pre-hunts. And then as you move down to those lower panes, you see there's a big shift there where they were spending time before the hunt, they moved to areas that they weren't. And one of the aspects here, thought this had a laser pointer, but if you can see there's the black kind of lines on there, that's our open road network. And so particularly during the elk rifle hunt, you can see the elk move substantially away from those roads open to motorized access in response to this hunting pressure. But one of the most consistent effects we see on ungulates is this consistent avoidance of motorized routes open to public use. And that is a key distinguishing thing there. It needs to be open to public use. Typically on private lands where there's way less traffic, you don't see a strong response on private lands to these roads. So it's not the actual feature itself they're avoiding, it's the associated human disturbance with that. We also see increased avoidance at higher traffic rates. So the more vehicles going down there, they move further away, increased road densities, and the response is greater during daylight hours when humans are active on the landscape. I'm going to switch now to talk about summer range. And we're talking about summer range. What deer and elk are trying to get out of this, put on fat reserves and raise their offspring that they give birth to in late May, early June. And so really the key thing on summer range is forage. And so you're gonna see a bunch of figures like this. This is called the marginal plot, showing relative probability of use on the vertical axis there. 0 means they really don't like that much, and 1 means that's where they want to spend a lot of time. And so you're going to see several like this, and then the x-axis will change. On this one, the DDE2 is related to dietary digestible energy. And so what we see, this is elk. This is the response of elk to DDE on the landscape. And so when we get to higher quality forage, so this is the amount of energy in that forage, when we get to some of the highest levels observed in the forage we have in the Blue Mountains, that's where elk want to spend most of the time. So forage is by far the biggest driver of where deer and elk want to spend time during the summer months. And what contributes to good forage, as we talked about early sterile conditions, but we also see related to forest canopy cover. So this is overstory canopy cover. We see a peak at about 40% canopy cover. It's kind of this moderate intermediate range of forest canopy is where they like to spend most of their time, but anywhere from about 20 to 50% canopy cover provides pretty good ungulate foraging opportunities. And we also see that deer and elk like to be closer to forest edges. Forest edges have some benefits from the standpoint, again, you have increased light penetration because there is an edge there, so a lot of shrubs and various things grow along that interface. But this also gives deer and elk some options where they can then go into the forest to seek security cover. They can go out in the open if they want to forage. And so those edge conditions create a lot of beneficial things for deer and elk from a forage standpoint and the ability to make some choices throughout the day or throughout the seasons of where they want to spend their time. Another key feature is riparian areas. And in some instances, it's pretty obvious, like this picture here. You know, that riparian area's got most of the grain forage available. This is also a dry landscape, so there's water available for the animals there. But these in forested systems, deer and elk also like riparian areas. They tend to be highly productive from a forage standpoint, producing quality forage, and these areas stay green longer later into the year, providing some of that late summer forage benefit. But these areas also provide hiding cover. You got lots of shrubs growing in there. They can get in there and lay down in those areas and have security. But there's also thermal cover. Riparian areas tend to be cooler as well. So this is kind of thermal refugia in here. And the fact that there is shade in here during those hot days, they can seek refuge in here. And again, the figure down the bottom just shows, this is for mule deer, that they do, in fact, like being closer to, this is intermittent or perennial streams. And back to motorized routes again, this is just actual results for elk out of the Blue Mountains, showing the relationship of predicted use. So again, from 0 to 1 on the y-axis, and then we're looking at distance from roads. So we see elk show a strong response in avoiding these roads open to motorized use out to about 1 kilometer. Then that's kind of the threshold of where they tend not to respond quite as strongly, the roads being open. And the two differences between those two plots look really similar. One is the response they have to highways or major roads, and major roads can include mainline Forest Service roads. And then secondary roads tend to be branches off those mainline forest roads. But we see the same response in elk and deer avoid roads as well to this motorized disturbance. When we transition into thinking about winter range habitat, what deer and elk are trying to do there is not lose their fat reserves and conserve energy. So it's completely different sort of mindset for them in the winter. It's conserving energy and trying not to die, where in the summer it's building fat reserves to make it through the winter. So one of the key things and biggest drivers for them during the winter is going to these areas without snow or have lower snow accumulation. And that's just really to reduce energy demands. So we've all walked through, well, most of us have probably walked through deep snow in our lives. It's not fun, and it's not easy, and you burn a lot of calories. Same thing happens to them. So it makes it a lot easier for them to move through the landscape, but there's also foraging efficiency. You got 2 feet of snow you got to paw through to get down to get something you can eat. You have to burn calories to even eat your food. So those snow-free areas are important. And that figure there just shows this is for mule deer winter range in South Central Oregon. The deer use is highest at areas there's absolutely no snow during the winter. Some other important aspects of winter range are related to cover, and deer and elk are using this for either thermal benefits, so reducing heat loss by getting under trees, preventing heat loss to the atmosphere. But this also intercepts snow. So snow's not as deep underneath some of these forested areas. And so again, energy efficiency. From the hiding standpoint, they might be reducing predation risk by hiding in certain areas. But one of the other big factors here is minimizing human disturbance. So they feel secure. If they've got some cover, they're less likely to be influenced by humans passing by either in vehicles or out walking if they feel that they're effectively hidden from what they are viewing as a predator. And not to say that forage is not important on winter range, they still need to eat. But and I'm not sure why I put a picture of an elk calf in the summer during a winter talk, but that is up there, but it's cute. But if we're looking at one of the key things on winter range is access to shrubs. Deer and elk diet shift towards shrubs during the winter. And some support we see for that is in these 2 panes below. So again, this is actually for mule deer, but they're wanting to be closer to forest edges on winter range. And again, that gives them some choices of being able to seek cover, but also foraging along that edge interface. And then we see they're kind of using these kind of mid-cover shrub areas. They don't want to be out in the wide open, but they don't want to be in those really dense thickets. Getting yourself into a really dense thicket could potentially have you run into a cougar without you knowing it's there, or something else. So kind of finding that middle ground there where they have some security and there's forage available is important on winter range. And again, hitting this point home here on motorized routes, this is the response of deer on winter range. Deer were actually responding out to at least 2 kilometers to roads open to motorized access on winter range in South Central Oregon. And if you think and look at that strength of that response too, that's really showing the deer don't want to be anywhere close, even within like a kilometer of a road, which is basically saying taking habitat. There's chunks of landscape they're just not going to use when there's motorized routes out there. Again, these are motorized routes. They are open to public use, not just the road itself. The other key aspect related to some of this is migration. So connecting the winter and summer aspects together. So why would they migrate? Again, it's to get to summer range where they have typically at higher elevation, you have better forage available to put on those fat reserves. And then go back to winter range to reduce your energetic costs and stay out of snow and try and persist through those conditions. On the right, that's a map of our migration kind of directions for each of our mule deer herds in Oregon. Pretty much everything is migratory, some more long distance. Up in Northeast Oregon, we tend not to see strong migration. It's more elevational shifts, just up and down to get out of the snow. With that topographic relief, they can get out of the snow pretty easily without having to move large distances. But migration, one of the interesting things about it, and particularly for mule deer, is it's maternally transmitted. Fawns learn how to get to winter range and summer range from their mother. And deer are very remarkable. They have incredibly high sight fidelity where they go to the exact same spot year to year, whether it's winter range or summer range. Almost exact same spot. They walk the exact same trails back and forth. So they really do learn this behavior from their mother. And one of the concerns here is these deer are very productive, these deer that are able to migrate compared to some of the deer that are resident on winter range. But there are threats to migration, things like fences, reducing landscape permeability. Deer and elk even things like pronghorn really do not like crossing fences frequently. So as you increase density of fences, the landscape's less permeable to them. And you also get direct mortality of that with entanglements in the fence. Then one of our bigger threats is highways, vehicle strikes. And if you get enough mortality, you're thinking about migration routes being culturally transmitted from mother to offspring. As they die, that migration route's starting to be lost, and we're losing that connection between summer range and winter range. So I'm going to conclude here talking a bit about habitat management. So we've looked at a lot of responses of how deer and elk respond to habitat management. And I'm going to start out with travel management, thinking about this motorized access. And elk distribution issues go way back into the 70s and 80s. This has been an ongoing issue in the Blue Mountains. And even back then, we knew some of the effects of motorized routes on elk behavior. This led to the creation of one of the first travel management areas in the United States, the Dry Beaver Lad Canyon project. This was a combination of some habitat improvements, so some thinning projects, mineral supplementation, and then also closing motorized vehicle routes in this area. And this was incredibly successful. We immediately saw elk restoring their migration patterns. They're a bit more flexible than mule deer, that they will pick up behavior from other elk and follow them around. And so we saw that where they moved back and forth the summer and winter range a bit better, but we saw a substantial increase in the use of public lands, and the elk stayed on public lands for a greater portion of the year and didn't move onto private and cause damage issues, which is an ongoing concern for the department. So closing roads is effective at altering elk behavior, and these travel management areas are one of the most effective ways to do it. If we think about vegetation management, one of the we've talked about earlier how we've seen this ingrowth of stands. So due to lack of, because of fire suppression and also past timber management activities, we are seeing these increased stand densities. We have that really dense packed forest there on the left. And on the right is an example of a fuel treatment in there where it's fairly obvious you're getting increased light penetration down to the forest floor there, which is going to allow forage to grow for deer and elk compared to the picture on the left. And so we look at this, the Starkey Experimental Forest and Range, looking at how they responded to fuel treatments up there. And there's some substantial benefits here. And so we'll start out looking here at, this is how deer responded. The y-axis on this is a little bit different than the early ones. This is probability of selection. So at 1, anything above that indicates deer and elk like using that more than random. And below that means they're avoiding it. And so on that figure, we're comparing the treatments, so the areas that were thinned to control areas or the untreated stands. We see deer do respond positively, where you're seeing selection for those treated stands post-treatment. And that benefit lasts 15 to 16 years before they start using that stand like they did pre-treatment. And why are they doing that? It's really driven by forage. So those figures on the right, we're looking at forage biomass of neutral species. These are species that deer and elk actually like to eat. Versus the one on the right is forage biomass that's avoided. And in the treated stands, we see that forbs, grasses, and shrubs are all occurring at substantially higher biomasses of things deer and elk do want to eat. But there's also less of the things they don't want to eat. And so by having less of things they don't want to eat, they can more efficiently forage as well. So better forage and a reduction in things they don't like to eat as well. If we look at elk response, again, looking at relative probability of selection here, so we have that value of 1. Anything above 1 indicates they like using it more. Here we're looking just at the treated stands, night versus day. So we see elk strongly select for these treated stands at night, and then tend to avoid them a bit during the day. That's likely related to security. They're going back to more hiding cover and not out in these more open areas during daylight hours when humans are out there. And again, we see similar benefits here for elk as we do deer, lasts about 15 years. So this is not a permanent fix. This needs to be ongoing, rotating these treatments around the landscape to provide these foraging opportunities for deer and elk. The other thing we look at here is timber harvest. So this is an older data set, even for Starkey Experimental Forest going back where we had timber harvest in the early 1990s. Effectively, we're talking about timber harvest here. These were effectively clear cuts. I think they were called shelterwood prescriptions. Seeing the pictures, there's a couple trees left standing, but they were effectively clear cuts. But we do see similar response here. So this is looking at the long-term response of the treated forest. That vertical gray line is where where timber harvest occurred. Elk responded to it immediately. See strong selection for it the year immediately after timber harvest occurred. And then we see that they are avoiding those untreated forests during that time frame. And then grasslands are on there as well, and they kind of use those as they're available on the landscape. We do see longer benefits from timber harvest, though. This is more looking at a 25 to 30-year benefit of timber harvest compared to just those understory fuel treatments. And bringing it back to this, so vegetation management, what we're trying to do is reset some of these successful stages back to provide foraging opportunities for deer and elk and increase forage biomass. And really what we're wanting to get here is practices that ultimately try to mimic a natural disturbance regime and create this patchy mosaic on the landscape. And this picture is not from Oregon, but just using this as an example of a range of forest conditions out there. And what you're doing is giving deer and elk choices where they have foraging areas, they have areas to go rest, find thermal cover, hiding cover, this mosaic of conditions. We also need to consider this from the standpoint of travel management. You go out there and create really good foraging opportunities, but have roads running through the middle of it that people are using, elk and deer are just not going to use those areas. So this needs to be conducted in consideration with vegetation management. And tying this back into climate change a bit as well, by having this mosaic of conditions, this is a more resilient landscape to disturbance. As we have climate change, having this mosaic also changes when things are green, whether it's got overstory canopy, it's complete clear cut down to very early sterile stages. Things will stay green longer when they have this mosaic of conditions that they can choose from throughout the year. That's really the driver here. And this isn't just for deer and elk. We need mosaic of conditions for all of our wildlife species. Some benefit from early sterile, some from older forests, some from mid sterile. And so really want to hammer home that we're looking for this mosaic of conditions on the landscape to benefit all of our wildlife species. And that's it on that.
Thank you, Darren. Very interesting stuff. So now we're gonna have another breakout. We're gonna go about 10, 12 minutes talking at your tables. And then when we're done with those, we're gonna check back in and share again a couple of main talking points. And then we'll take a break before we jump into some more research topics in the afternoon. Out loud real quick. So our questions for this breakout time is, was there anything surprising in what you heard? Is there more you wish you'd heard about these studies? And what additional questions does the research raise for you? Okay, so we need to, I heard a lot of great discussion again. We need to wrap things up and do a little report out on what was discussed at your table. I'm going to start we didn't name these tables, but I'm going to start at the table I'm going to start it as Commissioner Hatfield-Hyde said, this is table A over here. So table A gets to go first on this report out. And who would like to share with us just a couple of points you talked about?
So table number one, we talked a lot about the kind of the surprising distance from roads that wildlife are impacted from those roads. So kind of thinking about that in the context of the mosaic habitats that we would like to see, and then how you put roads there, or close roads if they're already there. And we just talked a lot about kind of different perspectives when we're thinking about these issues, the different forest types that each of us kind of picture in our heads when we're thinking about how wildlife might respond to some of these forest management and habitat impacts. And we also talked some about kind of the shrub component in the forests and how to make sure that we're maximizing that if that's an important forage type for our ungulate species.
Thank you. And over here, I think Tall was pointed at as nominated by his.
Well, just one point that we were talking about how complex so many of these issues are to start with. But I think one thing Oregon does particularly poorly is wildlife connectivity. Like, we don't have lots of overpasses. We've mapped mule deer migratory routes, but a lot of other states have invested in connectivity and overpasses. So I don't know where the money comes from. California just earmarked, I might get this number wrong, but I think it was like $150 million for bighorn sheep connectivity. And that's all I have to say about that. What are some other points?
And the other thing that we started with was just a desire to get this information out in front of a broader public. And so sometime talking about how much Oregon's public and people outdoors need to see this and understand this information.
So we also, I know, I'm learning my lesson. Okay, so agreed that I thought the same thing. This is such great information. We should get it out there on a broader scale. We talked about TMAs, how are they doing? Are they supported? There's vocal individuals who don't want TMAs. There's changes at the federal level that we are concerned about current TMAs. Are they at risk? Wildlife lovers, often the most quiet voices in the room. So, how do you deal with people who vocally disagree and want every road open? Some discussion of national forests allowing e-bikes on trails now. A few hunters recounted experiences of, yes, roadless areas provide better hunting. Then we also talked about replanting and how to make that work versus not work. Densely stocked stands don't mimic, what's good for fish and wildlife. So that should be avoided.
Thank you. And Michelle mentioned TMA, so that's travel management areas. And one of the things we have here in Oregon is the department and the commission has the ability to enter into agreements with landowners to restrict motor vehicle use for the protection of wildlife and wildlife habitats. And so that's what a TMA is. Commissioner Hall DeFries, would you like to share some thoughts?
Sure. Gosh, great graphs, Darren. I really enjoyed your graphs. Thanks. I'm a visual learner, so those were great. I guess I just had a couple questions actually, maybe for Darren. Are you seeing that type of information, especially kind of like the landscape scale, more mosaic type pattern in forested areas, is actually being translated into any type of management strategy on public lands?
Waiting on the microphone there for a second. I would say and I'm most familiar with Blue Mountains. without having a forest plan, it's incredibly difficult. The Forest Service doesn't have a whole lot of direction of what they're wanting to do. But I think the other challenge here is the scope and scale that this needs to happen to be really beneficial to deer and elk populations. It costs a ton of money to go out there and treat this that's not commercially viable. And so I think that's one of the big issues to address is how to do this and restore natural processes back to the landscape without spending every dollar we have available.
Great, thank you. My next question was, keep the mic. This is another question for you. I forgot about the learned behavior about the migration. You talked about that when we were out in Ontario in September. That kind of reminds me of sage grouse, you know, they're really loyal to their leks, and if the leks are destroyed, they won't go back. How are deer at all adaptive? Like, will they just figure it out, or are they just doomed if their mothers die and migration corridors don't exist anymore? What happens?
Great question. I generally not good. I mean, well, Fawn loses mom, its chances of surviving are not real great at that point, regardless. There is an analogy used by Kevin Monteith out of Wyoming, talking about a rose petal. So every time you lose these migration routes, you're slowly pulling out a piece of that rose. And deer don't have the flexibility in their behavior to repopulate that or learn that without learning it from another individual, which is typically their mother. Elk, a lot more flexibility. And it's one other thing kind of related to this is thinking about habitat treatments. For elk, if you build it, they will come. For deer, you've got to build it where they live. They're not going to move. They have such high site fidelity. Even if they live in the worst spot possible, that's home and they're not moving.
And that's, sorry, I don't want to keep belaboring this, but like that's why, so is that why, like, you know, in our swap, there's, I think, that's the right document. There's like those migration corridors, and that's where habitat improvement statewide should be prioritized.
Sarah says correct.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, everybody. These are great discussions. We're going to take a quick 10-minute break so you can get up, stretch your legs. We've been sitting for a while. It's 2:50 right now. Be back here and we'll jump into our next talk at 3 o'clock. Okay, so let's find our seats and get ready for the next section. Okay, so as we make our way to our seats, this next section is Dr. Joel Ruprecht, excuse me. And so we're gonna have a talk here for about 30 minutes following a breakout discussion. Yes. Joel Ruprecht from Oregon State University. We're Beaver fans here. And so here, I'll turn it over to you, Joel.
Right, well, thank you all for having me. It's an honor to be here. I really mean that. And I've never addressed the commission before, so wanted to thank you all for your service. I think the two things I want to do today is go over some concepts that we encounter in predation or predatory prey ecology. And in doing so, I'm hoping to convey that there's a lot of complexities involved with this. And so I'm going to go back and forth between concepts and some case studies. I thought we'd start really basic and just define predation. My definition is when one organism kills and consumes the other. And there's a little bit of a nuance to that, I think, because the killing and consumption part is, I think, important. If one animal consumed another animal that it did not kill, we wouldn't call that predation, it'd be scavenging. And I think it'll be really useful to have just a really quick primer in population dynamics before we get into this. So in the most basic sense, when we think about a population changing over time, we're talking about the births plus the number of individuals we get through immigration. And then from that, we're subtracting those that die and those that emigrate out of the population. And oftentimes we just ignore the immigration and emigration, assume it cancels out for the most part. So today, for simplicity, we're just thinking about births and deaths. I'm glad that Darren talked about demographic rates or vital rates because we have slightly different terms for these things. So that for births, we typically think of things like a reproductive rate, which might be decomposed into pregnancy and fetal survival, things like that. And then also recruitment, which would be the proportion of adult females that bring an offspring into adulthood. So they have a fawn or a calf, and it has to survive and enter adulthood, at which point it can breed. And so one useful thing to think about is that for a population to remain stable, each female in the population, on average, has to recruit one female offspring into the population in its lifetime, not just in a year, in its lifetime. So that seems like a pretty low bar to meet, especially for an elk that could live to be 20 years, for example. But the problem is that most juveniles die in their first year. And this is where predation comes in. It's a factor, it's not the only factor, but I think that we need to say that predation always or almost always has an effect. But the question then becomes how big of an effect? And maybe more importantly than that is how big of an effect relative to other factors. And so that's a theme I'm going to be revisiting throughout the talk. Probably the most important concept I think that we're going to talk about today is the two mortality types. We talk about additive mortality And that is, I say predation here, but really it could be any mortality source that results in a death that wouldn't have otherwise happened. So this is a little bit abstract, slightly hypothetical. In practice, it's really difficult to determine these things, but it's important to think about conceptually. And that's in contrast to compensatory mortality, in which case mortality or predation replaces another cause of death. And so an example of this might be a deer that is on the verge of starvation that gets killed by a predator. So yes, it was killed by a predator, but the deer was going to die anyway. We can also think of compensatory mortality among predation. So let's say a coyote kills a deer fawn, but really maybe that is just replacing a different form of predation. So we might, the fawn that the coyote killed might mean that there's not one that a bear would have otherwise killed. So it's slightly abstract, but really important to be thinking about it this way. The second most important thing, I think, is understanding that age classes of prey are not all equal. And also sexes are not equal. Males are not as important to the population, of course, because they don't reproduce. And so biologists use an analysis called a sensitivity analysis. We can look at all the demographic rates. These would be, adult, juvenile survival, pregnancy rates, yearly litter size, that sort of thing. For ungulates and probably all large herbivores, it's overwhelmingly the case that adult survival is the most important vital rate. So that's also a theme we'll be revisiting. And the flip side to that is that young and old individuals have low reproductive rates, and they're just not as important for future population growth. Jump into a case study here. These are elk that were killed in Yellowstone over a long time period and, by wolves. And you'll notice there's a remarkable consistency in the age of adult elk that these wolves are killing. They're about 15, sometimes 16 years old. And that's changed very little from the time that wolves recolonized Yellowstone until present, or at least recent times. And so why that matters, this is the same data here. So the gray bars are the distribution of ages of wolf-killed elk in the gray bars. So you can see like between maybe 11 and 19, that's when wolves are killing, or that's the age class of elk that wolves are killing. The blue line shows the reproductive value of elk. And so you can see that the reproductive value declines as elk age. And so the take home here, wolves, at least in this population, probably fairly transferable to other systems. Wolves are killing adult elk of low reproductive value. And so this is largely the same elk herd that were subjected to human harvest outside the park. And we see a very opposite trend. So humans are taking a much more random sample of the population. And that means that they're, in general, removing the individuals of much higher reproductive value. And so I guess just to revisit the additive and compensatory mortality, we would say generally mortality is additive when it's affecting healthy adult female prey. And the flip side is that mortality is often compensatory when it affects prey of low reproductive value. So again, young and old individuals or males. And that a good case study of this, I guess, is the fact that management, a very effective management tool, if a population is over objective, is to increase harvest of adult females. That's the quickest way that we can reduce the population. And this relates to the different hunting modes of predators, which are often classified into two groups. Coursing predators, these are animals like wolves that chase their prey, they run them down over long distances. That inherently is selecting for the weaker or older individuals. That's why they're killing elk in that 15-year-old range. You could contrast that with ambush predators, sometimes called stalking or sit and wait predators. That's best case of this is a cougar that's sneaking up on a prey and has a good chance of killing it no matter what age class it is. It's probably a fairly random sample of the population. There might be some bias towards younger individuals. And then we can think about the predatory abilities of each of these carnivore species and thinking about the window in which prey are vulnerable. And so for bears, black bears is here, but probably would be the same for brown bears and other bear species. They really only have about a 1-month period. Most of the mortality from bears comes in the first couple weeks. And so if prey can survive that first month, they have a very good chance of avoiding bear predation altogether. Very similar thing with coyotes. It's the majority of coyote mortality on ungulate prey happens again in the first couple weeks of the first month. Anecdotally, we've seen some instances with when the snow conditions are right, deer get trapped in deep snow, coyotes can remain on the surface. If there's a snow crest, so some adult mortality can happen. I just mentioned this, cougars are less selective, killing prey of all age classes. Again, maybe a slight bias towards younger individuals. When we talk about this, wolves are taking the either very young, like young of the year, or very old elk. There's also prey characteristics that are very influential to predation risk. Things like defensive abilities, that could be age. If you're a healthy adult, you have a good chance of warding off predators. Size matters. A moose probably can be more defensive than a deer, for example. There's some evidence the antlers may play a role in defense or fending off predators. That's less convincing, I think, the research is, but it could be a factor. There's also a prey adaptation that has sort of evolved over time. It's called predator swamping. So you might, throughout the end of June, beginning of July, you might see a lot of deer, fawns, elk calves, because there's a very distinct birth pulse. They're synchronized. And so the idea there is that if the prey species can do that, they can swamp the predators. They'll basically drop all the calves and fawns in a very short window. The predators can't get to them all. They become satiated, right? Other factors, security cover relates to what Darren just talked about. Habitat's really important. If there's security cover, if there's escape terrain, that can prevent predation. These are things that prey need to help avoid predation. And a really big one, again, related to what Darren just talked about, is nutritional conditions. So a very weak animal is not going to be able to defend itself as much as a healthy and strong one. Alternatively, if you're starving, you might have to go into more risky areas to forage. You might encounter more predators doing that, or even hunters or other mortality sources. So again, maintaining good habitat to keep ungulates at their peak nutritional condition is really paramount. But in addition to all that, nature is complex, and there are instances when predation is likely to cause significant declines in prey, even extirpation. So escape terrains that I just talked about can play a factor. Things like predator prey systems on islands. This is an example from Coronation Island off the coast of Alaska. wolves colonized, actually wolves were introduced to the island, and deer were extirpated before, before too many years passed. Another similar scenario related to habitat or escape terrain happened with the Madison Headwaters elk herd in Yellowstone National Park. And so before wolf recolonization, there was a non-migratory elk herd that basically carved out an existence by living in these areas around geothermal vents where there's access to forage year-round. Well, when wolves came back, they quickly found out that they could chase elk in the deep snow, capture them. That elk herd was reduced by a very large factor. Another way in which predators can have very significant effects on prey is through a process called apparent competition. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, even though it's a very important concept. Tal is going to talk about this later. But basically, I think it might be easier to explain with an example. So let's say that there's abundant prey, for example, moose, deer, elk, and so predators are supported by this abundant prey species. And then there might be a rare prey species like caribou that are occurring at much lower densities, but they're still subject to the same predation from this robust, large predator population. And so that can cause very dramatic declines in the rare prey, caribou in that example. So why doesn't predation always lead to population decline or even extirpation? Well, there's a number of reasons. First of all, predation is risky. It's not easy, and it's not safe to kill an elk with your mouth. And so wolves, and probably everywhere, but there's a lot of evidence in Yellowstone. A lot of my examples are from Yellowstone because they have long-term data sets. They find wolves with broken jaws. A lot of times those wounds are fatal. So it doesn't really make sense for predators to incur that risk to kill more than they need to. It's risky. Talked about this a little bit. There's physical and physiological limitations of predators. Wolves can't run forever. If elk are in better condition, it's very likely that the elk will succeed. In fact, I think that given an encounter with elk, I think wolves are only successful in killing elk less than 10% of the time, 5 to 10% of the time. So they're good predators, but they're not super predators, I think is a good way to put it. Sure.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Is that true for deer too? Studies on deer?
I would, for deer, I would imagine it was higher. Yeah. I don't know the exact figure, but yeah, I would imagine healthy deer could outrun wolves in a lot of instances, but I think you're correct to point that out. But I can look up that value if there's research done, but yeah, point well taken. And another factor, the scientific term for this is called handling time. So wolves can't kill and process prey instantaneously. It takes time. They have to find them, they have to capture them, they have to kill them, and they might consume them over a week period. They become satiated. They don't need to kill again. And so this draws out the process, right? They're not killing every day. They're not killing every hour, that sort of thing. It slows things down. Switching gears a little bit, predator control. I think that's something useful to talk about. I'm going to start with results from a review paper that came out recently. Respected predator prey ecologist from University of Montana wrote this. They reviewed 62 predator removal experiments, and overall they did find that on average, with high variation, but on average, prey populations increased about 13% over the course of the study. And the studies range from a year or two to many years. And so to put that in perspective, you have a population of 1,000 deer or elk or whatever, over the course of this predator control experiment, on average, you gain about 130 individuals. So is that a big effect? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, I think. And it's relative to other factors, right? Other factors may or may not be more important. And so this is from that same paper. The horizontal black line is showing no effect. Anything above the line is showing a positive effect, meaning that prey populations did increase. Everything below means that they're actually prey populations did not increase. And so the dots are showing kind of the lines and the dots are showing the distribution of results that were obtained in these 62 studies. So yeah, there are a lot of times that predator control does have, you know, fairly large effects on prey, but there's also times that it has the opposite effects. And so this is getting back to the complexity involved in all of this. So some lessons, I guess, from predator control. Why does it not always work? The main one, I think, is that it has to occur at really high intensity and it has to occur over long time periods. In addition to that, it's likely that multiple predator species would need to be targeted. Again, getting back to that compensatory mortality concept. And so let's say we only remove coyotes, which, you know, some states do, Utah is doing it. But the fawns or the deer that are saved by coyotes, are they then just eaten by bears, that sort of thing? So you might have to target many or multiple predator species to get that desired effect. So there's some challenges. It's not as cut and dry as you remove a portion of the predators and the prey population skyrockets. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. When is predator control necessary? I don't know that I'm able to answer this question. It's value laden. It's, you know, there's social aspects of it. I'll speak from a biological standpoint. The southern mountain caribou herds in BC and Alberta, they used to be in Idaho and northern Washington. I think they're functionally extirpated from the lower 48. They're barely hanging on in BC and Alberta. And this was a paper that recently came out. The scientific consensus, as far as I've been able to tell, is that to save southern mountain caribou, which is a subspecies, we're not talking about caribou in general across their range, would likely require some level of wolf removal. This is a really terrible slide. The only thing I want to point out is that the status quo, that would be if we did nothing, the caribou will go, they'll become extirpated. There's a very high probability of it anyway. The interventions that could be done, at least the ones that are able to like dramatically reverse this trend, all involve some type of predator control, wolf control, maybe wolf control combined with other things. So there's times when it might be more justified than others. I want to highlight another case study. This was a pair of interesting studies that happened, I believe in around 2010. Two very respected mule deer biologists, Mark Hurley in Idaho and Chad Bishop in Colorado, undertook this complementary studies. I believe there's coordination between the two, but they were addressing different things. So Idaho removed experimentally cougars and coyotes. They did not alter nutrition in any way. In contrast, this Colorado study improved deer nutrition, but did not remove predators. This is just an anecdote. As I hopefully demonstrated. There's a lot of variation, but in this, maybe the two most robust studies to investigate this, the take-home mortality was, take-home message was that the mortality was compensatory in the Idaho predation study. So they removed coyotes and cougars. But I think a lot of that, the benefits were then diminished because of a hard winter that came. And so overall, they did not observe any benefit to population growth overall. Contrast, the Colorado nutrition study saw quite a dramatic increase. So the population before the study began with, the population was growing about 3% per year. At the end of the study, it was increasing by about 17% per year, which is quite dramatic. And so just to, I guess, expand a little bit on the relative importance of predation versus nutrition. A very interesting takeaway from that Colorado study was that by increasing the body condition of deer through manipulating their nutritional resources, they reduced mortality, of course, from malnutrition, but also from predation. So predation went down when the deer became in better condition. And so I'm not sure what that relates to, probably defensive abilities, that sort of thing. And I guess another thing I'd like to point out is that improving nutrition also has the added benefit of improving reproductive rates as well. Reproductive rates in ungulates are very, very closely tied to body condition. I think Darren mentioned that. Sure, yeah. I believe both. Yeah, I believe both.
You go back to that Idaho's. Yeah, one more.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, and I may have glossed over this. I'm not sure how much time I have. So adult female survival, again, a critical piece. It did improve by 3 percentage points after cougar removal. So I don't want to say that there was no effect. Just overall population growth didn't lead to a change.
They were Idaho hunting regulations on cougar. Can they use dogs there or not?
They can use dogs, and
So very likely, I mean, that's when our cougar population exploded here, was when so very likely if you use dogs, you can help keep that population of check. Cougars, like I think we were doing here until
yeah, and I guess one thing I'd add is that I don't believe they did this strictly through hunter harvest. I think that it was a large campaign. They were removing coyotes from aircraft. I think that it was a very concentrated effort. They put in a lot of resources to remove cougars in these areas. Mm-hmm. Yep. Great. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks for that. Sure. Oh, I jumped way back.
So can you kind of repeat the question, paraphrase it if you can for folks?
Yeah. I'm sorry for doing that, or for not doing that the first time. I don't know why I just started over. Am I going backwards? I don't multitask well. Oh my gosh. Okay. I've already forgotten the question. How did they improve nutrition? Yeah. Okay. I believe it was a combination of habitat improvements and supplemental feeding. So supplemental feeding is something I won't necessarily advocate for. I believe is more of a a demonstration that if you could get nutrition up, then that's what, that's something that you may encounter. All right, I'll move forward here. If I have time, I'll talk about this last case study. So this is fascinating system. It's Isle Royal. It's an island in Lake Superior. It's unique because it's a single predator, single prey system. So moose and wolves. I think both wolves and moose crossed an ice bridge and colonized the island in the early 1900s or the first part of the 20th century. And they've collected really good data since then. And so again, think about this. It's an island with wolves and moose. And I think to go back to the complexity of it all, you would think, at least it would be very fair to think that moose and wolves confined to an island, the wolves are going to kill them all, right? That's not what happened at all. The wolves, these are in the open dots, they were increasing by a lot, until that point, in which case disease broke out as parvovirus. The wolf population totally crashed. Around that same time, or just after that, that allowed the moose population to grow basically unbounded. And they overbrowsed the island. There wasn't enough to eat. Then the moose population crashed. And then where we stand as of about, 10 years ago or so, the wolves actually became extirpated from the island. There was inbreeding, and the National Park Service ended up replenishing wolves on the island as well to keep the system going, study for another 60 years maybe. But I guess I just want to emphasize this is that even within an island, it's very hard to predict what might happen based on the suite of interacting factors. Thinking about other factors, there's mortality from non-predation sources that are more selective of these prime-aged individuals. So for example, vehicle strikes, that's largely taking a random set of the population, meaning a lot of adult females are being killed. ODOT collects, I think, about 6,000 deer carcasses per year. Who knows how many they miss? Probably many more than that. So this is, not as insignificant source of mortality. Human harvest of adult females, again, it's a great management tool if the ungulate population's too high. If the population is struggling, that might be a really good, easy way to, alleviate some pressures on that herd. And then extreme weather events. So we have a master's student in the lab. He also works for ODFW. He's analyzing a huge data set on mule deer survival. He's finding that severe winters are probably the greatest factor in influencing deer populations in Eastern Oregon. And so I think the take-home message, and this is the end of my talk, is just that, yeah, absolutely, predation plays a role. But if these other factors are significantly reducing adult female survival, then reducing predation might not help, or it might not help to the degree that we would otherwise expect. So that's all I have. I don't know if it went over or not. Is Darren?
Thanks a lot, Joel. That was great. We're gonna have another little breakout. I'm gonna cut this one a little bit shorter. So let's take about 8 minutes in your group. Same questions as last time. Was there anything surprising that you heard? Is there more that you wish you'd heard about these studies? What additional questions? And then we'll do a real quick check-in with each table before the final talk of the day. my table first, and I'm going to hand the mic off to somebody.
A little bit of humor. We pretty much concluded that women are what keeps the species alive, and that's in the human population too. So, so all the men, the women are going, "Yep, you're right." I don't know. We kind of all over talking about what your information was extremely valuable and extremely useful, and what I took away from it, I think we had head nods, is, nutrition is a huge factor. And so we've got to put a lot of emphasis on nutrition. I see Sarah nodding her head as a Habitat Division Administrator. So it is huge. And and the other thing I think we took away from the conversation was it is so complex and articulated that, there's not just one answer to everything. And research is a valuable tool that helps us move in somewhat of a positive direction. And so we need to continue to get the information out there about what the research is showing us. And we had one little discussion about the deer, maybe more research on deer, but we talked about the Idaho situation there and then trying to extrapolate that to Oregon. Can we do that? And then can we extrapolate the elk situation in Yellowstone to Oregon? Possibly, but there might be some clinkers in there too. So did I capture it?
Yes, great job, Commissioner Labhart. The only other thing I remember was the importance of having some takeaways from some of these talks. I'm gonna pick on you guys next.
Broadly, we talked a lot about the Idaho study and I guess some of the caveats that could exist there. And I think we largely talked about the Idaho study. And the other part of it too was just differences in how cougar populations are managed between Idaho and Oregon. Idaho still has one of the management tools available through hound hunting to or closely regulate cougar harvest, particularly in specific geographic areas.
Thank you. And we'll jump to the last table here. Buddy.
Yeah, I think kind of the take home again was like complexity was the underpinning here, and just kind of some of the difficulties surrounding like the data requirements you need to document and track some of these things. We also talked a little bit about kind of that, or I think the point that Joel made that was really hit home was the kind of hunting strategy of the different predator species and how that contributes to selection of different kind of demographic groups for ungulates, and talked a little bit about kind of what this in the context of wolf recolonization in Oregon specifically, and how that plays into, where they might end up and how that might affect ungulate populations based on those habitat types and such. Yeah, so I mean, I don't know, really complex stuff, but I thought Joel did a wonderful job kind of demonstrating some of these things.
Thank you. Commissioner Hall DeFries.
Yeah, I don't think great presentation, really interesting stuff, but I don't think I have much to add other than what was already said.
Okay, perfect. So our next presentation is going to be on the ecological impacts of large carnivore recovery in North America. Dr. Tal Levy from OSU, getting the computer set up here. I'm going to do it. And so we've got about 20 to 25 minutes here, and then we'll have some reflections at the end as we finish up today.
Right. Well, I thought we'd end by having a little fun and also taking a little bit of a historical perspective about the way humans have thought about predation and populations. And, the context really is that we've had large carnivore recovery. There is a lot of doom and gloom in the world, but it's kind of a neat thing to remember that large carnivores in North America are recovering And I want to go way back to 100 years ago, which is really when we got started with animal ecology in nature. And I'm going to talk about two different threads, like the thread of ecologists and the thread of wildlife biologists, which are not exactly the same, but do a lot of cross-pollination. So in ecology, we owe a lot to Charles Elton because he's a British animal ecologist. And back then, the field of zoology was really in the lab looking at embryos. So Elton was a naturalist who wanted to go out in nature and do experiments and observational data on wild populations, which you'd think would be obvious, but everything sort of has to start somewhere. And there we go. And so in the early days of animal ecology, he wrote the first animal ecology textbook in 1927. This is the way we really thought about the world, with this thing called the pyramid of numbers, which is really energy moving up through food webs from producers, so things that can make their own tissues like plants from sunlight, up to primary consumers. So that's really what we're talking about today, deer and elk, the things that consume them, and then in food webs that have more trophic levels, the things that consume those things. And so Elton spent a lot of time constructing these complex food webs, these really descriptive things. This is for an island in the Arctic. And he says, start at marine animals and follow the arrows. And so we're just watching energy flow through food webs. And the next most influential figure, I think, is Paul Arrington, who is one of Aldo Leopold's students. And Paul was also a naturalist who's known for conducting these extremely long-term, rigorous field studies. And at this time, following on the way Elton thought about things, the idea was that predators remove a doomed surplus of weakened individuals, individuals in marginal habitat that are subdominant or socially excluded. So the dominant idea at the time was that predation mortality is largely compensatory, not additive. Right? But at the same time, Paul Arrington's mentor, Aldo Leopold, wrote his essay, Thinking Like a Mountain, in 1949. And in Thinking on a Mountain, he writes, I have lived to see state after state extirpate its wolves. I have watched the face of many a newly wolfless mountain and seen the south-facing slopes wrinkle with a maze of new deer trails. I've seen every edible bush and seedling browse, first to anemic desuetude and then to death. So he's making the point that predators play a really important role at suppressing herbivores and releasing vegetation. And so we're going to come back to this because this idea plays a large role in the Yellowstone reintroduction and narratives around that, and we're going to interrogate some of these ideas. Okay, so on the ecology side of things, the first big idea that maybe predators play a really big role is credited with Hurston, Smith, and Slobodkin in 1960. This was called the green world hypothesis. The idea is the world is green because predators suppress herbivores. Okay, so this is like a change in how we're thinking about it, but this is really a data-free argument. They're proposing this as a hypothesis. When we start to find data that this can happen, oh, actually, one more thing to say. It doesn't sound like that novel of an idea, right? Predators affect herbivores, release prey. So it turns out in chapter 3 of Origin of Species, Darwin has a really similar story. It talks about cats suppressing field mice that might suppress bees that pollinate clover. And so whether or not you have cats might influence clover. So these sort of top-down effects from predators down to lower trophic levels to plants, something even Darwin thought about. But actual good data where we can really see strong effects of predators really starts with Bob Payne, who was actually Smith's student from the Green World hypothesis. So he was a new professor at University of Washington, and he goes to Tatoosh Island. And in Tatoosh Island, you find this diverse intertidal community. And so starfish, sea stars, are the top predator in that system. And so he chucks them all into the ocean, removes them from the intertidal, and the system collapses into one that is mussel dominated. And this is an important study because this is where we get the term keystone species. And at that time, keystone species really meant it. It meant that you remove this one species and everything collapses. Right? We use this now for species that maybe that's not quite true about, and wolves included. And so we'll talk about them a little bit more. Okay, why is Bob Payne so important beyond keystone species and experimentally demonstrating strong top-down control? Well, he did another experiment with urchins, moving urchins from the ocean floor, showing the release of kelp, right? And so He's a new professor. He goes out to the Aleutian Islands where he meets a young Jim Estes, who was a graduate student at the time, studying energy flow up through food webs to sea otters. And Bob tells Jim, that's boring. Stop studying energy flow up through food webs. Study the role of sea otters in the community. And this leads to the 1974 paper on sea otters playing a major role as predators in communities. And here's another relatively unambiguous keystone species, similar to the sea star example, because sea otters consume lots of urchins. With fewer urchins, you get kelp, and with kelp, you get a whole kelp forest community. So this set the stage in sort of the history of ecology of sort of cottage industry of predators must be playing these really important roles everywhere. And the next most famous sort of set of experiments are Steve Carpenter's lake experiments. These also really dramatic effects. Whether or not you have largemouth bass, that's what we have here on this Clear Lake side, determines lake chemistry sort of dramatically because largemouth bass consume planktivorous fish that consume zooplankton, that consume phytoplankton. So with these series of lake experiments, whether or not you have this predator leads to these big dramatic effects, like you see with sea otters, like you see with sea stars. But Don Strong, who's the longtime editor of Ecology, was like, well, okay, we have these case studies, but trophic cascades are all wet, meaning they're in these aquatic systems, they're in systems where the producers can't defend themselves, like the algae, non-vascular plants. And so I would say in the field, there was nowhere near consensus at this time that top-down effects were in general very important. So they proposed the null hypothesis for how systems work should still be bottom-up. And this gets to the heart of what we're talking about today, about the role of nutrition versus the role of predation. And in the modern world, we think a lot about top-down forcing, and that's a lot because of the Yellowstone example and the Kaibab Plateau story that sets it up. So since Thinking Like a Mountain, the Kaibab Plateau stories is largely seen like a parable that Aldo Leopold was using to teach about the importance of every member of ecosystems. But there's been a lot of critiques of this. It's been called a myth. Graham Coughley has an ecology paper in 1970, but there's been a few key points of emphasis. One is that there was no discrete predator removal event. Wolves were already long gone before deer started to increase. But this is the big one, is that from the 1880s to 1906, when Roosevelt established the Grand Canyon National Game Preserve, sheep and cattle were severely overgrazing the plateau. And then when Roosevelt established this, all the livestock were removed by executive order. So they removed hundreds of thousands of livestock from the land. And so this idea that what changed was predation is not supported by evidence. We reduced all of the other ungulates from the landscape, releasing forage for deer on the Kaibab Plateau. Okay, but that story is really influential with wolves in Yellowstone, and the exact same process seems to have happened, where the story maybe gets a little bit away from us, we collect a lot of data, and we realize that things are a lot more complex. So I want to talk about a few of those complexities. Joel mentioned the Madison Firehole region. Almost all the stuff you've heard about Yellowstone is this northern range herd, which winters partially outside of the park, which is going to be important for the story here. Okay. The setting for this is that this is the year of aspen recruitment, and the top panel is all the aspen stands that are unprotected, and then these are the ones that are caged, protected from elk. And the black triangles here are the last year any aspen recruited. And so it had been many decades before any aspen reached above 200 centimeters in height. So there was this major problem with vegetation. And so people really wanted it to be true that the moment you introduce wolves, you're going to get this recovery of aspen. And then now it's been 30 years. So we've had a bit of time to see what's going on. And so the two main players in the story are aspen and then willow. So here's the other part of the story is these riparian areas that had very little willow, some of which have quite a lot of willow now. And this is largely work out of OSU by Bill Ripple and Bob Beshta. Okay, so first question, wolves cause this. It better be true that wolves cause this decline of elk. So let's just review what's going on in Yellowstone here. We have elk that are maintained at lower density by active management. Then we have the policy of natural regulation. And then we have wolf reintroduction and this precipitous decline in elk. Right? Surely wolves caused the decline of elk. Okay, I'm going to argue that it's very, very clear that that's not true. So the paper, I mean, you hear it all the time, but it's very clear this is not true. Okay, so John Bucetich writes a paper in 2005. Elk declined by 8.1% annually, right? Okay. First thing is that there was aggressive cow harvest, those elk when they left the park. I tabulated the harvest of this herd. It was 7,500 elk in the first 3 years. A lot of elk. You can go see the full table in this paper. How many elk were removed? Okay, so this is a little bit complex, but in black, the black circles here is the observed trajectory of elk. Then I want you to focus on these triangles. The triangles is what you would expect the elk to do with just the harvest. Okay? The squares are what you would expect the elk to do with just the climate. With just the climate, you'd expect it to be stable. But the dashed line is the expected trajectory of elk under the climate conditions and the harvest. So harvest played the overwhelmingly largest role in what was happening here. So since 2005, no subsequent study has been conducted. And so we talk about this in our review paper that I think was attached for some of you. Other reasons that we know that wolves alone did not cause this problem is that we have detailed evidence from Yellowstone of elk that are followed and monitored for cause-specific mortality. So we know that cougars killed a larger proportion of the elk population than did wolves. And we know that bears are the dominant calf predator. And so Joel mentioned that adult females are really, really important. But adult female survival remains high and stable. What primarily drives elk population dynamics is juvenile survival, because that varies quite a lot. Even though each juvenile is not very important, juvenile survival varies a lot. And so we know we have a lot more complexity to the story, and that's the theme of the day, right? And then we know what Joel talked about earlier. The average adult killed by wolves is 15. The mode, so the most common, is 16 years old. So they're killing a lot of old animals, whereas hunters are killing 4-year-old elk. So much larger role based on the life stage being killed. Okay. And then I just really wanted to touch on the willow story. Willow are increasing in size in Yellowstone, but the pictures you see are cherry-picked examples of some of these points up here. But if you look at all of these long-term plots, these are basically what's been happening naturally is the control. And these points in the middle here, that's what's happening on average. So on average, willow have not yet increased above 200 centimeters. That would be what you would see as widespread recruitment above browse height. If you fence them and remove all herbivory, they have just recently crossed on average 200 centimeters, some plots much higher, some plots lower. But it turns out that water really matters for willow. So if you simulate beaver dams, you get a very similar response to fencing. And only when you simulate beaver dams and completely fence them do you get this large response where on average, they're now at 300 centimeters and most things have now recruited above browse height. So what the point of the story is, there's things you wouldn't even think are important that might play a large role in vegetation recovery. Getting back to our complexity story. I don't have time to talk about aspen, but I want to talk about a few other examples and maybe end on some exciting videos, cool animals doing cool things. Okay, so we've done a lot of work on wolves in Southeast Alaska. And in some of our wolf populations, they started eating this very surprising critter, sea otters. And Joel talked about apparent competition earlier, but we found that sea otters can be supporting wolves to remain abundant even as deer decline. I want to talk to you about one case study on that. It's an example of where predators can have a large effect. So sea otters are reintroduced by Alaska Department of Fish and Game in many parts of Southeast Alaska, but in the Glacier Bay region, that was in 1965. And by the 2010s, they'd spread throughout Glacier Bay and then across Pleasant Island. And so we've been working throughout this region, but I want to focus on Pleasant Island here for a second. So in this region, sea otters really took off. And you can see by the 2010s now there's in the vicinity of 10,000 sea otters. So quite a lot. Took decades to get there. Okay, so we just so happen to be working with these wolves across the full Alexander Archipelago. and got some samples from Pleasant Island in the vicinity in 2015, and we started seeing sea otters in their diet. Like, what? How are wolves getting sea otters? That doesn't even make sense. And then in 2016, they ate more sea otters than deer. So this is the frequency in their diets. And by 2017 and onward, they were eating a primarily sea otter-based diet. So we've been working with this population since then. We still have wolves on this island. In 2025, we have no deer. Right? So wolves have been able to extirpate deer. What we have here are indexes of deer abundance. Red dots are from pellet group surveys, and blue is from hunter harvest. Wolves colonized the island in 2013. They've probably been on the island on and off over the last 100 years or so, but this time they entered the island with sea otters available, and the deer population has crashed and remained low. Wolves continue to reproduce even without ungulates. So we think our dogma is that wolves are obligate ungulate predators. But here's a system, no ungulates, wolves persisting and reproducing. And so the question is, was this the historical baseline? We haven't had sea otters for a century. Sea otters are coming back. Do they support wolves on the mainland and suppress large herbivores? So to answer this, we have paired studies with sea otters or without sea otters in these different national parks in the Gulf of Alaska. And then I want to touch on the parent competition that Joel talked about with woodland caribou. This was a really interesting experiment where, so land use change is making habitat better for moose, deer, and elk, depending on where you are in British Columbia and Alberta. And these are in systems that would have had low densities of these ungulates, and then they would have had caribou consuming low quality vegetation and eking by in a system where predators are uncommon. So things like forestry and climate change have allowed increases in these ungulates, suppression of caribou. So this experiment reduced moose across 6,500 square kilometers, and then had a control area of 11,500 square kilometers. And the basic result here is that moose reduction led to stabilization of the caribou populations, and no intervention with moose, caribou populations continue to decline. So suggesting that manipulating something you wouldn't even think to manipulate moves up to reduce wolf density and can help stabilize caribou populations. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing in Oregon with ODFW, because there's a lot of interesting complexity here, but this is sort of a mental model we use in these carnivore portions of the food web, is that large carnivores like cougars and wolves suppress smaller carnivores, which we call mesocarnivores. They can suppress even smaller carnivores. And the consistency of these relationships are not always what you might think. But large carnivores also provision these guys with food. So this is work led by Joel Ruprecht at Starkey Experimental Forest. And we call it risk-reward trade-offs in these carnivore communities. So really big study, so 1,200 carnivore scats. So our lab does the genetics portion of these samples. So from this, we estimate population density of each species and diet. And then camera grids inside of Starkey and then around Starkey. And in blue here are the tracks that these dogs use to find the scats. And then these are the GPS tracks of cougars, coyotes, bears, and bobcats, all collared in the same area. This was 3.5 years of Joel's life, plus a bunch of other people at Starkey, collecting this amazing data set that allows us to see how these organisms interact in space. And because cougars are collared, you can then find their kill sites and put cameras on them. So there's kill site investigations and monitoring. This is the fun stuff I wanted to end with. So. Okay, so if you put cameras on these things, what you find is that a lot of critters visit these cougar kill sites. And I know they're worried I'm going to go too long, so I won't let you watch videos as long as you otherwise would. But all right, as long as you're cool with it. So these carcasses turn out to be conflict hotspots. So here's a bunch of coyotes that are working on getting this cougar off this kill. And there, that cougar's running after them. And so we have examples. This collared coyote was killed by a collared cougar that scavenged one of its kills. Right, so there's a risk to this behavior. And the question is, well, how much are they really getting from cougars? Is this a big part of their diet? How important are cougars to their movement ecology? And it turns out quite a lot. The other player in this story is black bears. Also visit a lot of cougar kills. Okay, so with all of the GPS collar data from cougars, we've got home ranges here and the polygons, and then these are all cougar kill sites, kills on the landscape. And because we have, what happened there? Because we have coyotes collared in the same area, Joel was able to show that this is similar to the graphs that Darren was showing. They're very attracted to areas close to cougar kills. So they're being drawn into cougar kills. This part, I just showed at day 1, but this persists for about 30 days. Yeah. After 30 days, this starts to become flat. Okay, the most surprising result to me by far was that coyotes eat what cougars eat. I would not have expected this much elk in coyote diet. Right? Bobcats, no elk at all. Talk a little bit more about this in a second, but we have no evidence that bobcats are scavenging. Coyotes are scavenging a lot. Bears, some. Bears can also kill their own elk calves in the system. But deer are eating primarily, cougars are eating primarily elk and some deer. Those kill sites that you saw cameras of, about 90% of them were visited by coyotes. So 90% of every cougar kill visited by coyotes is remarkable, and about half of every cougar kill visited by bears. So still getting to more complexity. We've got cougars kill things, but they also subsidize other predators. But they also kill a lot of coyotes. Right? About 20% of all the coyotes are killed by cougars every year. And we think this number went up with an experiment I'll talk to you about later, but we ran out of years of data here. Okay, so we have risk-reward trade-offs in these communities, but everything's changing with the introduction of wolves, right? Cougars have been the dominant species here, and they've got coyotes scavenging from them. Now this is a system in Yellowstone where Wes Binder in our lab is working, and this is a cougar that was killed by wolves. So now cougars are efficient predators. They don't rely on scavenging, but now there's a new species that is kleptoparasitizing, so stealing their kills at very high rates and killing them. So we've got interactions between our apex predators. What will be the effects on each other? What will be the effects on prey? And how is this modulated by things like landscape context, tree cover, topographic roughness? So sticking with the complexity story, but I just want you to imagine you're this cougar on the neck of this elk, and you've just worked really hard to make that kill, and the wolf pack steals it from you. That's got to feel real bad. It turns out this cougar was not successful at killing himself. Okay, do I have enough time to talk about this?
Yeah.
5 minutes? All right, I got time. Okay, so everything's very complex, right? And I want to talk about that complexity and how we might work to disentangle it. So we're talking a lot about predation here. So there's cougars preying on elk feeding on vegetation. But then we have competition. So we have deer and cattle feeding on some of the same resources. We have apparent competition where we've got two prey species potentially competing through a shared predator. One supports the predator. We've got other competitors you don't always think about, rodents and hares, rabbits. We've got bears that eat a lot of vegetation, but bears also eat deer fawns and elk calves, and they also scavenge from cougar kills. And then we've got all these things that benefit from small mammals like coyotes and bobcats, but those things can also prey on deer fawns and elk calves to some degree, but they're also killed by cougars. So it's really hard to put this all together and explain what's going on without experiments. And so Starkey Experimental Forest has done a really amazing experiment because the data I showed you earlier from Starkey with those videos was Joel's PhD research, which was this period before the elk density reduction. And so before the density reduction, or at the initial stages right here, we have that camera trapping grid inside Starkey and just outside Starkey. So we have a control site and then a treatment site. And in the treatment site, elk density was reduced quite substantially. So really low density here, quite high density there. So here's what the camera grid looks like. The circles are all the cameras in the treatment site. That's where elk were reduced. And then the X's here where they were not reduced. And so the broad effect we observed, I'll show you some more interpretable figures here in a second, but was that all of the competitors, the things that eat vegetation, were released. So this is how their abundance changed relative to the control site. This included black bears, included small mammals, included the lagomorphs like hares, white-tailed deer, and to a lesser extent mule deer. And there's a lot of complexity in these relationships, but I'll show you some of the more interesting ones. So orange here is main study, which is the treatment area. The left of the dashed lines is before the reduction, to the right is after the reduction. And so blue is the control sites. So you can see that bobcats stayed constant approximately. This is number of photos per camera per week in the control area, but then you get this big increase after the elk density reduction. So bobcats are responding, we think, demographically to the increase we observed in rodents and hares, because those things were no longer competing with elk for a lot of forage biomass. Black bears, a similar response. They particularly appeared in spring when there's a flush of nutritious vegetation and they're primarily herbivorous. There's complexity here. They could be moving more often to find fewer elk calves, and we see them more often on camera. And white-tailed deer, got a big increase in white-tailed deer. And I think that's likely because they're have less site fidelity than do mule deer. So they can move into Starkey from outside. That might even be why we get maybe a slight declining trend, but this increase in the treatment area. Okay, so what are the messages here? Species interactions are really complex. We're in this web. They're even more complex than I've talked about because they're modulated by things like climate and landscape context. Unraveling that complexity is really challenging with observational data, but we ended with an experiment as a potential way we can make inference about broad suite of members of the community. So that might be a way we can make inference here in Oregon as well. And that's all I have for you. That's a cool wolf, right?
Yes, thank you, great job. So we're done with the presentation now, so I'm gonna stop sharing. Hope I didn't mess up anything there. I think we all probably earned 1 or 2 OSU credits today, except maybe we'd have to pay for those, and I don't know that we want to. One thing I do want to say, that elk reduction at Starkey, that was an intentional elk reduction after studying elk demographics, response to hunting, vehicle disturbance response, a number of different things. We were intentionally reducing elk in Starkey, looking at deer response to that. And so that just to be clear on that. If you didn't pick up on it, I think a lot of speakers talked about an overarching theme. Like one of our themes today is just how complex this predator-prey interaction is, how complex wildlife management is. And I want to leave you, I'm going to take just a quick 2 or 3 minutes. Darren will cringe. I'm going to talk about some of the work that Darren's group is working on right now, and I'll try to make it as short as I can. And then we'll wrap up with an opportunity for reflection from any of the commissioners or the director if they'd like, and then we'd call it a day. So right now, we are really looking at some of those interactions around mule deer. So we've got 2 studies going on, paired study, one in the John Day area and another down in the Klamath Basin, where we're collaring mule deer. This is, and I think Tall would agree, some of the most comprehensive work going on right now in the West, looking at changes in demographics for mule deer based on nutrition conditions and habitat, as well as predation, the interaction of those two, really to get us at answering questions. We've got all these factors that are influencing the landscape. We talked about some of them today: recreation, predators, changing forest management, climate, development. We've got all these things. Some of those are levers that we can pull. Some of those are levers that we can't pull. They're in someone else's hands. Or in the case of climate, like we're not sure who will be able to pull those levers, if anybody. And so as we look at all these things, we need to understand how things are interacting. And so in this study, we're collaring mule deer does. We're also collaring fawns at birth, and we're collecting weight information, health information, fat on our does. We're tracking those through the year, looking at them again in the fall. We're doing some vegetation work. So we're looking at how vegetation affects health of the deer. We're looking at the suite of predators on the landscape. So cougars, coyotes, bears, looking at different densities and looking at how survival varies amongst the deer, adult doe survival, fawn survival, with different predator densities and different predators on the landscape, different habitat conditions. Because we do have some opportunities to pull some levers as it comes to predator management, deer harvest levels. And we work with our partners on habitat as much as we can. And so as we look at where we're going to invest our time, invest our limited resources, where we're going to have the most effect, and sometimes it's going to be on habitat, and sometimes it might be on predators. But we want to know where we're going to be effective with that. We want to make wise decisions. So we're in the middle of this work. Tall's group is part of that research, as well as others. We're pretty excited. It's going to be a few years before it's done. But if you want to know a little bit more about that, Darren and I spoke during legislative days at the Senate Natural Resources Subcommittee hearing about 2 weeks ago. Part of Darren's talk was giving them an update on those studies, and we can get that link to that hearing out to you so you could take a look at it. And so with that, maybe Director Colbert, I'm going to look at you. Would you like me to open it up to any commissioner reflections and then maybe back to you?
Absolutely top-rate presentations from top to bottom. I can't overstate that. The takeaway that's been running through my mind all day has been nutrition and habitat, and how there are many factors in the landscape and complexities with predators. But one factor that's so critical in my mind is if we're going to increase ungulate populations is nutrition and habitat. And we can do some things about that, and we can't do some things about that. We can work with other agencies, with our private landowners, public land managers. And so that theme just hit home for me, clearly. Thank you for all these great presentations.
Ditto to what Dave said. I would just add that, you know, I'll speak for myself now, but we're all generalists. We don't have the science background. But we do set policy that's really, really important, and we got to base our policy on that up there, the mission statement. And I always like, where's the science? Where's the biology? Where's the facts behind us? And we rely on staff to present that, because we can't have you come to every commission meeting. And so I just think this has been hugely valuable for me personally, to listen to that, because we get pulled in different directions about science and biology. And so it's nice to hear. So I want to compliment staff. This was a lot of work to put this together, and the presentations, in my opinion, were excellent. Also, we've been asking for something like this for a while, and we need to do this with fish also. Director, you know, it's the same kind of a thing. Teach us some more about some of the issues with science and fish and the policy decisions that we face there. But so, and I realize this is only just a small capsule of what we're dealing with you know, predators and the science behind it and research studies. But this has been hugely valuable for me. So thank you.
Thank you. I would just add a couple things. One is ditto, absolutely. It gave me an enormous amount to think about from listening to this today. I think that I would sum it up for the way I'm going to walk away thinking about it, but to something that Tall said right at the end, which is, like, when we think about ODF and W, there's one lever or two levers, major ones on each thing. The walk away I have after listening to these collective presentations is it's more like those musician boards where they have all kinds of levers and they move them all, and it's us and it's agencies and it's all kinds of other groups. And this agency is good at that. So it gives me some hope, because this agency can work with other agencies, with NGOs, with whomever, to figure out how to move all of those. It's so nuanced and so complex that moving them all together somehow So thanks for that image. It's maybe the wrong one, but it's a great image to use.
So yeah, tremendous amount to reflect on and things that are really thought provoking. I guess for me, one thing that, and maybe it's a minor point in all the other things that you all presented for us to think about today, is the impacts of recreation and sort of the double-edged sword that we're facing as we want people to connect with the natural world in various different ways and get out there and value, wildlife and again, the natural world more broadly, but the impact that has on wildlife that I don't think many people who are out there, whether they're hiking or mountain biking or whatever it is that are doing, really think about. Certainly, I think it's easy for folks to maybe point the finger at motorized recreation, and that was shown to have among the bigger impacts. But that's not the only thing that has an impact. So how do we, again, encourage people to get out there and value the natural world, but do it in a way that doesn't have outsized impacts? Coming back to what you were saying, Mark, about, we're always encouraged to follow the science, and so great to hear a lot of what you presented today. There's a tremendous amount that we know, but it's always hard for me to think there's always more that we want. There's a tremendous amount we don't know that we're trying to continue to dig at and really need to really effectively address the situations that we're facing. And then the degree to which things are so site specific, right? We can paint broad brush kind of thoughts about how things might have effects if we do one thing or another. But again, the conditions at a particular place and time could make a huge difference in what those impacts are. So again, so much we know, so much we still need to know, which makes me really grateful that we have places like Starkey, that we have institutions like OSU and great people like you all doing this research. And thank you for you applying your intelligence and your hard work and your excitement to this. Really, really what you brought us today.
Nice. Yes, I want to, in Dallas, I know you need to go, but I'll go really quick and then you get to go, okay? All right. But I just want to really thank all the presenters today too and the department for putting this together. Pretty incredible. And also want to say that when we were in Ontario, I was like, bring us something different than what we've been hearing. And I think you did today. So thank you. It was more complex. I also want to say that I have a dear friend who said the most irresponsible thing she ever did was become a parent. And I think about, this is humbling, right? Like it's kind of irresponsible to be a commissioner in a way, because this is so much complexity that we're trying to deal with in a way, right? Like so many factors. So I was thinking about that chart that you showed of, like, here's the bears, here's the small, this, that. You're putting in all these factors. And what if we were to take that chart and then we're like, let's bring, the mountain biker through, and let's bring another wolf through, and then let's bring the highway through, and let's, oh, I know, I'm homeless. I'm in a camp here. And now I'm, like, what are all the ones, guys, that we were talking about today? Paige, yeah, let's have a catastrophic fire. And how about the heat dome? And, by the way, we're going to, what else, guys? Yeah, the ATV and the, my cows, some disease, yeah, it's just a lot, right? Like that big flip chart, or I was thinking we could do it like how we do the water, with kids in school, where we do the little water cycle thing. Like, what if we had salt shakers that was that, okay, here's the hikers, let's sprinkle them in. And let's sprinkle a few hunters in, it's just a lot of complexity, right? So thank you guys so much, but I do feel very humbled again, because there's so much we don't know. So thanks.
Commissioner Hall DeFreeze, did you have something you wanted to say?
Sure. Yeah.
I'm not calling on you if you don't want to, but.
No,
Commissioner
I'll
Hatfield
always
Hyde
say
brought that up.
something. It may not always be good. Yeah, what a fun, I love ecology. I thought the presentations were really fun. And also a little full circle moment. I think I was finishing my research on Starkey Experimental Station when Joel was just starting, and I never got to see the outcome of his research. So that was really fun for me to see today. I was scared about the camera traps because I was always worried about the tree I was trying to hide behind to go to the bathroom when he was putting those up. So, anyways, I hear what Commissioner Hatfield Hyde is saying is like, these are really difficult issues. I also find a lot of beauty in it and just like the complexity and, we are humans trying to make decisions in this extremely complex world. And we're not even really talking about the social aspects, that confound all of that. And so I think that as commissioners, it's humbling to take these complex issues, and part of our job is to try to translate these into real world decisions. And I think that is an extremely difficult thing to do, is to take science and research and knowledge and translate it into real world action. And so that's kind of where my head is at and my takeaways today. But I just thought all the presentations are great, really fun. I love the topic. So thank you, everybody.
I just, again, to the complexity of this whole issue is, it is mind-boggling. It helps me change, I guess, some of my opinions. And, just going through this, when we talk about the landscape scale drivers of change, some of us that are older have seen this, my area there in Celeste, I've seen those changes where we went from the clear cuts in the national forest to, and you just, I guess we've experienced exactly a lot of what we heard here today. And anyway, just like I say, appreciate all the input.
Final thoughts. Again, thank you to everyone that did just such outstanding presentations today. And to our commissioners, again, I have said it many times, some of the hardest working volunteer commission members in the state of Oregon, right here in the room, sitting, having these conversations, and just thank you for your level of engagement. We tried to hit a good combination of setting the table with good information, but giving you the space to kind of process it together. I warned you at the beginning there wasn't going to be a feeling of closure today. So I think you're probably going, yep, that was true. But I think it's going to set the table for so many future conversations with you, with our stakeholders, with our staff, whether you're thinking about a wildlife area plan, that will be coming to you, or setting regulations. I mean, I think these are the kinds of things that give us a common vocabulary, but also understanding for when you have to make those tough decisions, like Commissioner Hatfield Hyde mentioned. So just thank you for being so engaged today. And I don't know about y'all, but like, I'm so excited that this was recorded, because I'm going to treat it like a podcast where every time I'm driving, I'm like, I'm going to listen to the Predator Prey podcast today and just like run back through all that. So anyway, just thank you for being a part of the workshop, and to everybody that did the work together. So, but I remember about